Growing up in a small town, there wasn't much in the way of excitement. People talked, rumors spread, and every so often, some local radio DJ would latch onto a story and run with it. I remember one particular Halloween season when everyone was talking about strange noises in the woods. Some said it was a pack of coyotes acting strange, others swore it was something else. Something bigger, something that shouldn't have been there. The most popular theory was a werewolf. I never believed in that kind of thing. Monsters weren't real. The idea that something supernatural was lurking in the woods felt ridiculous. Still, the talk was everywhere. It got so bad that even adults were bringing it up in casual conversations. My friends and I thought it was a prank, a radio station stunt to get people riled up for Halloween. It was funny to us, just another silly thing to laugh about while sneaking cigarettes and talking about boys. We had no reason to take it seriously. That changed when I spent the night at my best friend's grandmother's house. It was an old home, settled deep in the woods, the kind of place where the night felt darker and the air carried sounds farther than it should. The house sat at the top of a gentle hill, with a large pond stretching out below the back deck. Beyond the water, there was a line of kennels where they kept hunting dogs. Big, muscular hounds meant for chasing down deer and wild hogs. Those dogs were loud, always barking at something, their deep voices carrying through the trees. That night, my friend and I snuck out onto the deck. We had stolen a pack of cigarettes from her older brother and took turns puffing on them, trying not to cough too loudly. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and the faint, acrid sting of tobacco. The moon was out, silver light reflecting off the pond's still surface. The dogs were restless, yapping and howling at something in the distance. First, we thought they were barking at us. Then, all at once, they went silent. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, the kind that feels wrong. Dogs don't just stop like that unless something bigger, something meaner, has caught their attention. My friend and I looked at each other, the glow from the kitchen window casting long shadows over our faces. We were both thinking the same thing. What the hell was out there? That's when we heard it. A howl, long, wailing, but cut with something sharper at the end, like a bark but not quite. Sounded wrong. I know what coyotes sound like. I know what dogs sound like. This was neither of those. It was something else entirely. The noise carried through the trees, echoing back at us from the hills, wrapping around the house like a living thing. It made the hair on my arms stand up, my stomach twist into knots. I've never heard anything like it since. We stayed frozen, barely breathing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. The howl came again, closer this time. My brain scrambled for an explanation. A deformed coyote? A bird with some kind of throat injury? A dog with a strange bark? Anything was better than thinking about what people had been saying on the radio. Then we heard the rustling. Something big was moving in the underbrush beyond the pond. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet. It moved with confidence, like it knew we were watching. The wind carried a scent up to us. Something musky, wild, and foul, like an animal that had been rolling in its own filth for days. My stomach turned. I wanted to go inside, but I couldn't make my legs move. Then the dogs started up again. They weren't just barking. They were losing their minds, snarling and howling like they wanted to rip something apart. The sound of claws scraping against kennel walls filled the air as they lunged at the fencing, desperate to get loose. But they weren't running toward the noise. They were trying to get away from it. I've never seen hunting dogs act like that before. They weren't afraid of anything, at least they weren't supposed to be. But in that moment, they were terrified. A branch snapped, louder this time. It was closer, too close. I finally snapped out of it, grabbed my friend's arm, and yanked her toward the door. We stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The house felt suffocating, the air too thick, our breathing too loud. We crept to the window, peeking through the curtains, but the backyard was nothing but darkness and shifting shadows. The dogs kept howling. The trees swayed in the wind, but whatever had made that noise was gone. We didn't sleep that night. Every little creak, every gust of wind scraping against the house sent us into a fresh wave of panic. By morning, it was easy to pretend we had overreacted. that it was nothing more than a coyote with a strange bark or some weird echo through the hills. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week later, another call came into the radio station. A hunter, deep in the same woods, claimed to have seen something. Something big, something fast, something that didn't move like any animal he had ever tracked. He refused to go back to that part of the forest, said he'd rather leave the deer alone than risk running into whatever it was again. I never told anyone about that night. Not really. It was easier to laugh about it, to brush it off as a stupid teenage scare. But even now, years later, I sometimes find myself thinking back to that sound, that horrible mix of a howl and a bark, like a scream cut short. I've tried to recreate it, to find an animal that matches the noise we heard. Nothing ever comes close. Maybe it was just a coyote with a throat infection. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was nothing at all. But sometimes when I'm outside at night and the wind is just right, I think I hear it again. Faint, distant, carried through the trees. And I go inside, lock the door, and pretend I didn't hear a thing. I had taken my nephew and his friend out camping near a diversion dam in a remote canyon. The plan was simple: spend the evening around the fire, then wake up early to fish. They were both about 14, old enough to handle themselves but still young enough to get excited over little things. As we settled into our spot on the dam, the boys quickly realized how well sound carried in the canyon. For the next half hour or so, they took turns hollering and listening to the echoes bounce back. It was harmless fun, but the thought crossed my mind that we might be drawing more attention than we wanted. By the time they tired themselves out, we had already burned through most of the firewood we'd collected earlier. The night was settling in, and I faced a decision. Either send them up the road with flashlights to grab a few more logs from a slash pile we had spotted earlier, or take the truck myself and bring back enough to last the night. I decided on the truck. No point in sending two kids into the dark when I could just do it myself. I had the boys hop in with me, thinking we could all grab wood together and be back in a few minutes. As soon as I started the truck and swung it around, the headlights swept over the road ahead, and there he was, a full-grown mountain lion, a massive tom, standing not 30 feet in front of us. He had been coming down toward the dam, probably curious about all the noise the boys had been making. His golden eyes reflected the headlights for a second. Then he turned with a slow, deliberate motion and disappeared into the brush like he had never been there at all. The boys were frozen in place, gripping onto each other in the cab. I could feel the tension rolling off them, and I wasn't much better. My scalp tingled. The hair on my arms stood on end. I've spent plenty of time in the wilderness, seen plenty of animals, but there is something different about a mountain lion. Something that taps into a deep, primal fear. He could have been watching us for hours, for all I knew. Could have been waiting, deciding. I put the truck into drive and got the hell out of there. The 6-mile stretch back to pavement was tense. The boys sat in silence, gripping the seat like we were fleeing for our lives, which, in a way, we were. My mind was racing. Had the cat been watching us from the start? Had we been too loud, too careless? I felt a creeping discomfort, an understanding that we had been in danger long before we even realized it. We didn't sleep there that night. I wasn't going to take the risk of that thing doubling back, maybe deciding we were worth investigating a little closer. We left everything, the tents, the gear, the cooler, everything, right where it was. We didn't even turn the truck off until we were safely home. The next morning, after the sun was fully up, we went back. I half expected to find our camp torn apart, signs of the cat all over. But everything was exactly as we had left it. No tracks, no signs of disturbance, like nothing had happened at all. The only thing left was the feeling in my gut, the knowledge that for a brief moment, we had been on the menu. Years later, I found myself in another situation, one that felt just as unsettling, though in a different way. I was camping at a remote lake with a few friends. The area was quiet, rarely visited. We liked it that way. It was just us, the lake, and the woods. Sometime in the middle of the night, the sound of engines echoed through the trees, trucks coming in fast. I unzipped my tent at the same time as my buddy. We were both on edge immediately. We were armed, but neither of us had anything in our hands yet. We just stood there, watching as 3 trucks barreled into the clearing near the lake. The people inside were drunk. That much was clear. They started spinning donuts in the dirt, kicking up dust, and shouting at the top of their lungs. Then the gunfire started. They were firing into the air, hooting and hollering, completely oblivious to our presence. The dirt and gravel they were throwing up started pelting our trucks and tents. I could see the look on my buddy's face. He was worried, but not for himself. His wife and 2 little kids were inside their tent just a few feet away. We stood there, frozen, watching and waiting. There was nothing we could do, not without making things worse. If they saw us, if they decided we were worth messing with, it could turn ugly fast. We weren't looking for a fight, especially not one we were outnumbered in. It felt like it went on forever, but in reality, it was probably 10 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they arrived, they took off, racing back up the dirt road, still shouting and laughing like they had just had the time of their lives. We didn't sleep after that. We stayed up, listening, waiting, wondering if they would come back. Every sound in the woods made us tense. A twig snapping, the rustling of leaves. Anything could be them returning for round 2. But they never did. The next morning, we packed up and left. There was no real discussion about it. We all knew we weren't staying another night, not with the chance that those guys might decide to come back. Some people think the scariest things in the wilderness are the animals, the predators, the things that can kill you with tooth and claw. But sometimes the worst thing out there is other people. We had only been together for a few months when we decided to take a late-night drive out to a secluded spot near the river. It wasn't anything official, just one of those places people knew about. A couple of fishing spots, an old concrete pad where people built bonfires, all tucked away in the middle of nowhere. We both liked places like that, quiet, open, and away from the world. Perfect for drinking and talking for hours without worrying about anyone bothering us. That night, the air was thick with humidity, the way it always got in late summer. The bugs were out in full force, and the smell of the river carried through the trees. We built a fire on the concrete pad, using wood left behind by whoever had been there last. The flames flickered and danced in the darkness, casting long shadows. The night was completely still except for the occasional rustling of leaves when a breeze picked up. We sat close, sipping cheap whiskey from the bottle and enjoying the way the fire crackled and spit as it consumed the wood. It was late, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, when it happened. The sound came out of nowhere, slicing through the night like a knife. A scream, long and drawn out, filled with something raw and awful. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound like an animal, either. It was somewhere in between. It was high-pitched at first, almost like a woman's voice. But then it dropped low, turning into something guttural and unrecognizable. My blood went cold. I froze, gripping the bottle in my hands. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The fire popped, sending up a spray of embers, but otherwise, everything was silent again. I swallowed hard, trying to slow my breathing, but my chest felt tight. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. The fire didn't reach far beyond the clearing, but I stared out into the darkness anyway, trying to see something, anything. The trees stood still, no movement, no sign of anyone or anything out there. He turned down the music we had playing on his phone. The sound had felt normal just a moment ago, but now it felt intrusive, like we were exposing ourselves by making any noise at all. Another scream, and another, each one getting closer. It didn't stop, just kept coming in these ragged, broken cries that set every nerve in my body on edge. We hadn't seen a single vehicle come down the dirt road in hours. No one else had been out there, at least not that we knew of. But something was in those woods, and it was moving toward us. He stood up first, kicking dirt onto the fire. The flames hissed and sputtered but didn't go out completely. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking as I got to my feet. The sound kept coming, closer and closer, filling up the space around us. It felt like it was coming from every direction at once. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say. I scrambled into the truck while he poured the rest of his drink onto the fire, snuffing it out completely. The sudden darkness made my skin crawl. I locked the doors the moment he climbed into the driver's seat. We pulled out fast, kicking up gravel, the headlights bouncing over the uneven ground as we headed toward the fishing spots down the road. If there was someone out there, we'd see them. Maybe a car, maybe some idiot messing around. Something that would make this all make sense. But there was nothing. The fishing spots were empty. The water lapped lazily against the shore, undisturbed. The trees stood still, untouched by any wind. The screaming had stopped. Just silence. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. "It's probably a panther," he muttered under his breath. "But we're getting the hell out of here anyway." I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Everything in me screamed that we needed to leave. He turned the truck around, and we drove back toward the main road, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires. The drive back felt longer than the drive in. I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see something darting between the trees, some shape just out of reach of the headlights. But there was nothing, just dark woods stretching on forever. We never went back after that. Not at night, anyway. I don't know what we heard. Maybe it was a panther. Maybe it was something else. But even now, all these years later, I can still hear it, raw and terrible, echoing through the trees. And I still don't have an answer. I grew up in a rural town in Georgia, the kind of place where summer days stretched long and slow, where you'd spend the daylight hours barefoot, running through fields until the evening cicadas hummed and the fireflies started blinking. We had miles of open farmland surrounding our neighborhood, and beyond that, an old sand pit that had long since been abandoned. Just past it, tucked inside a small grove of trees, sat the remains of an ancient graveyard, older than anyone could tell us. The stones were worn and crumbling, the engravings faded beyond recognition. We found it one summer when I was around 14. The graveyard wasn't large, maybe 15 or 20 graves in total, all scattered beneath a dense canopy of oaks and pines. Some were upright, but most were cracked, toppled, or sunk halfway into the earth. Slabs of rock, most likely markers, lay hidden beneath layers of leaves. No one in town seemed to care about it. There was no fence, no church, nothing marking its existence. It had been swallowed up by time and neglect, sitting alone in that copse while the farmland around it changed hands and purposes over the years. That summer was suffocatingly hot, the kind of southern heat that makes the air thick, where sweat clings to your skin the second you step outside. My mom had no patience for us hanging around the house complaining about the heat, so she kicked me and my friends out every morning, telling us to find something to do. That was how we ended up spending so much time out in that graveyard. We'd hike across the dry grass fields, climb the ridge near the sand pit, and step into the shade of those trees. The thing was, the moment we stepped inside the copse, there was wind. Always. No matter how still the air was outside, inside the trees the breeze moved. It wasn't violent or unnatural, just steady. On those oppressively humid days, it actually felt like a relief at first. A cool breath of air where everything else was stifling. But I noticed early on that it wasn't normal. On one particular day, the air outside was completely still. Not a single blade of grass stirred. It felt like stepping into a pressure cooker, the sky hazy and thick. But the second we entered the trees, the wind met us. The branches swayed gently, the leaves rustling overhead. I turned back, looking out beyond the graveyard's edge. The field outside was motionless. Not even the highest branches of the trees along the ridge were moving. It was as if the air existed only inside that space, circling among the graves, never escaping beyond them. First, I tried to explain it away. A stand of trees in the middle of an open field would naturally catch whatever breeze there was. But I knew enough about wind to realize that wasn't right. If a breeze were blowing through the trees, the outer branches should have been moving. They never were. The movement never touched the outside. It only existed within the boundary of that graveyard. I didn't say anything to my friends at first. We had our routine. We'd go in, brush off the leaves from the stones, try to decipher the faded engravings. Sometimes, we'd dig out the fallen slabs and try to write them, as if we were preserving something forgotten. It felt like we were supposed to be there, like it was our own little hidden piece of history. But the wind never stopped, even on windless days, even when thunderstorms rolled in and the world outside was heavy and silent with the weight of an approaching storm. The moment we stepped inside, the air moved. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to go alone. My friends were busy, and I was restless. The heat inside the house was unbearable, and I figured the walk might cool me off. By the time I reached the ridge near the sand pit, the sun was sinking low, casting the field in deep orange. The air was still. No wind, no relief, just thick, suffocating heat. Then I stepped into the trees. The wind greeted me immediately. The sound of leaves rustling, branches shifting, the steady push of moving air. It wasn't strong, just enough to stir the dust on the ground, enough to feel against my skin. I walked further in, past the first few headstones, and knelt beside a sunken slab near the center of the graveyard. I ran my fingers over the stone, tracing the barely visible letters, trying to make out a name. The wind tugged at my shirt, whispering through the trees. I glanced up, watching the branches sway. Then, slowly, I turned and looked back at the field beyond the trees. Not a single blade of grass was moving. Not one leaf stirred on the branches outside the copse. My stomach twisted. My mind ran through every explanation, every logical reason for why the air could be moving inside and not outside. But I couldn't find one. That was when I heard it. A sound, not quite a voice, not quite the wind. Just a shift, like someone stepping through dry leaves behind me. I turned fast, my pulse jumping. Nothing. Just the gravestones, the trees, the wind that shouldn't be there. I stayed crouched, listening. The air pressed against my back, cool despite the heat beyond the trees. Then another step. Closer. I shot to my feet. My hands were shaking. I scanned the ground, looking for movement, but there was nothing. I was alone, but the wind was still moving, still circling, still whispering through the leaves. I walked quickly back toward the edge of the copse, my body tense, my heart hammering. I stepped out of the trees into the open field. The moment I crossed the threshold, the wind stopped, just like that. One step, gone. The air was thick, heavy, unmoving. I turned back. The leaves inside the trees were still shifting. I stood there for a long time, watching. Outside, it was dead still. Inside, the wind moved. Always. I never went back alone after that. We still took new kids there, still cleared off the leaves when we had the chance. But I never let myself be the last one to leave. I never lingered when the others started walking back. Because I knew it didn't make sense. It shouldn't be possible. But I had felt it, heard it, stepped in and out of it. Something inside that copse moved the air, and it never stopped. Years later, I went back as an adult just to see if it was still the same. The fields were overgrown, the sand pit half filled in with weeds. The trees still stood in that same tight cluster, untouched by time. And as I approached, I watched carefully. Outside, the grass was still. The air was thick and unmoving. But inside, the trees swayed. The leaves rustled. The wind still blew. Always. I've spent years camping alone, traveling to remote places where the silence stretches for miles. I know the sounds of the wilderness, the way the wind shifts through the trees, the way the earth settles after dark. I've camped in places that would terrify most people, miles from another soul, surrounded by the unknown. And I've never felt afraid, not truly afraid, until that night. It started as any other trip. I was traveling through a rugged stretch of desert and mountains, a place I had camped before without issue. I had spent the day exploring, taking my time, stopping to help a stranded driver along the way. It took longer than I expected, but I didn't mind. It was late in the afternoon when I finally pulled up Google Maps to find a site for the night. I wanted somewhere isolated, a place where I could park my truck with the camper shell and enjoy the stillness. I found a promising spot, a narrow dirt road leading into the foothills, away from the highway and any signs of civilization. When I arrived, I knew I had chosen well. The campsite was well used but empty, perched on a small plateau overlooking the valley below. The towering mountains rose behind me, their jagged peaks catching the last light of the sun. It was perfect. I set up my chair and table, started making dinner, and settled in for a quiet night. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned from gold to deep blue. The air cooled quickly, and a strange hush fell over the landscape. I had spent countless nights alone in places just like this, but something felt different this time. The moment true darkness arrived, an unease settled into my chest, slow at first, creeping like a shadow at the edges of my mind. At first, I ignored it. I continued eating, listening to the distant whisper of wind through the brush. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I sat facing the valley, my back to the mountain, and the sensation of something approaching from behind me became impossible to ignore. The hair on my arms stood on end. It was as if something massive and unseen was descending the mountain, a force so overwhelming it pressed against my entire body. I turned my head, scanning the darkness behind me. There was nothing, just the silhouette of rock and sparse trees. But the sensation remained, a silent presence bearing down on me. It was suffocating. My breath came faster, my muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I felt fear before, rational fear, like the sudden snap of a branch in the dark or the sight of fresh bear tracks on a morning trail. But this was different. It was a fear without shape, without sound, a deep, visceral terror that I couldn't explain. And that made it worse. My mind grasped for logic. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I had spent too much time alone, but nothing made sense. Every time I glanced at the distant headlights on the highway, they felt impossibly close, as if they were coming straight for me. I had never felt anything like it. The night had changed completely. The clear sky had vanished behind thick clouds, and the full moon, which should have illuminated the valley, was completely obscured. The darkness was absolute. The silence was deafening. Not even the wind stirred. I knew I had to leave. There was no question about it. I tossed my half-eaten dinner aside, shoved my chair and table into the back of my truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. My hands trembled as I started the engine. The moment my headlights cut through the darkness, the weight of that unseen force seemed to intensify. I could feel it behind me, pressing against me, urging me to go. I threw the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road. The fear didn't lift. If anything, it clung to me, thick and heavy like fog. I glanced in my mirrors, half expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the vague outlines of rock and brush. Mile after mile, I drove, my grip tight on the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fear remained, though it slowly began to fade as I neared the highway. It was like I was passing through an invisible barrier, like something had been clinging to me and was now retreating. By the time I reached the pavement, the suffocating dread was nearly gone. I pulled onto the shoulder, hands still shaking, and took a deep breath. What the hell had just happened? I sat there for a long time trying to piece it together. There had been nothing there. No sounds, no movement, nothing tangible to explain the fear. But I had felt it. I had felt it so strongly that it drove me away from what should have been a perfect campsite. I ended up spending the night in a roadside turnout, exhausted but unable to shake the unease. Even then, hours later, with the safety of civilization closer, I couldn't forget the feeling of something watching me, something pushing me away. I've camped alone countless times since that night, in remote places just as quiet and isolated. But I have never returned to that spot. I don't think I ever will. The night air was thick with humidity as we started our hike. Late summer in the Appalachians always had a way of holding onto the day's heat, even well after the sun had dipped below the tree line. I was walking the Ridgeback Trail just off the Appalachian Trail with a man named Will. He had seen something in these woods a few years back and was eager to show me the spot. I wasn't a true believer in the stories of Sasquatch, but I wasn't exactly a skeptic either. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know that strange things happened in the wilderness. The trail wound through the forest, narrow and uneven, littered with roots and loose rock. The last storm had been weeks ago, but the evidence was everywhere. Fresh deadfall tangled with older, rotting limbs. What struck me as odd, though, were the formations. I'd seen plenty of wind-thrown trees before, but some of these had been woven together in a way that didn't seem accidental. One particularly large branch had been jammed between two trunks at least 7 feet off the ground. Another had been bent into an arch, both ends anchored beneath heavy stones. Will pointed these things out as we walked, nodding like he'd seen it all before. "You ever seen these before?" I asked. He shrugged. "Here and there, always in places where people talk about sightings." I didn't know what to make of that. We kept moving, the incline getting steeper, the trees crowding in close. Every so often, I caught glimpses of the sky through the canopy, deep black with scattered stars. The cicadas were loud, their droning call blending with the occasional hoot of an owl. The farther we went, the more I felt the weight of the woods. I was used to night hiking, but something about this stretch of trail made my skin crawl. It wasn't fear exactly, just an overwhelming awareness of the trees, the darkness between them, the feeling of being watched. Eventually, we stopped at a small creek to refill our bottles. The water was shallow, clear, running smooth over a bed of round stones. I crouched down, letting the cold water run over my hands before filling my bottle. That's when Will nudged me. "Look over there." I followed his gaze into the trees. About 20 yards in, there was a light, a soft, reddish glow, floating about 15 feet up. It wasn't flickering like a firefly or moving like a flashlight. It just hovered there, steady and unnatural. "What the hell is that?" I muttered. Will didn't answer right away. We stood there, just watching it, neither of us moving. It was about the size of a cantaloupe, and the more I stared, the more it seemed to pulse, like a slow heartbeat. After about 10 seconds, Will finally spoke. "It's an orb." I turned to him. "A what?" He was still staring at it. "An orb. It knows we're talking about it." The moment he said that, the light dipped down, disappearing behind the underbrush. I felt the hair rise on my arms. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but there was no explanation. It hadn't moved like a firefly, and it sure as hell wasn't the reflection of anything. It had been something else. We kept moving after that, both of us quiet for a while. My thoughts were running in circles. If I'd seen the stick structures and written them off as weird storm damage, now I was questioning everything. I'd heard about people seeing lights in these kinds of places. Spook lights, some called them, but I'd never thought I'd see one myself. As we hiked on, my expectations shifted. If this really was the kind of place where strange things happened, then what else could we experience tonight? I half expected to hear rocks being thrown in our direction or to catch a deep, distant howl cutting through the trees. By the time midnight rolled around, we were still moving, our conversation looping back to Bigfoot sightings. The air was warm, and I was sweating under my pack, but the thought of stopping made me uneasy. We were deep in the woods now, no other hikers around, just the two of us and whatever was out there. Then we heard it, a deep, guttural laugh. He. It came from the thick brush just off the trail, maybe 25 feet away. I stopped dead in my tracks. Will did too. We turned toward the sound, headlamps cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I swallowed hard. My pulse was hammering. That laugh hadn't sounded right. Too deep, too slow, almost unnatural. I felt my stomach twist. Was this it? Was this my close encounter? The silence that followed felt stretched too thin, like the whole forest was holding its breath. My instinct screamed at me to turn and walk the other way, but I forced myself to stand still. I'd read things online about how to handle situations like this. People always said to speak calmly, to acknowledge whatever was out there without showing fear. I cleared my throat and forced out the words. "It's okay. We're just passing through." Will echoed me. "It's okay." A pause. Then, from the darkness, "All right." The voice was human, tired, maybe annoyed. I exhaled, tension leaving my body all at once. The sound hadn't come from something inhuman. It was just a guy, some camper, probably woken up by our voices. Maybe he'd heard us talking about Bigfoot and decided to mess with us. Or maybe he'd just been half asleep and responded instinctively. Either way, the spell was broken. We kept walking, shaking our heads, laughing a little at ourselves. The woods weren't haunted, and there was no monster stalking us through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that night. Maybe it had just been my imagination, or maybe there really was something out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, listening. Either way, I wasn't in any rush to come back and find out. The summer I turned 10, my parents took me and my best friend, Josh, on a camping trip in northern Utah. They had just bought a second-hand camper, one of those compact trailers with a tiny kitchen, a cramped bathroom, and bunk beds stacked against the wall. To me, it felt like a small adventure home on wheels. We set up at a quiet campground near a lake, surrounded by pine trees that swayed with the warm afternoon wind. The air smelled of sun-baked earth, pine sap, and the smoke from distant campfires. Josh and I had been best friends since kindergarten. We did everything together. Raced bikes, built tree forts, stayed up too late watching scary movies at each other's houses. This trip was supposed to be another adventure, just in the wild instead of our neighborhood. As soon as we arrived, we ran off to explore, leaving my parents to set up camp. The campground wasn't huge, but it had winding dirt paths, clusters of campsites spaced far apart, and a small lake down a sloping trail where people swam and fished. It was along that path, near the tree line, that we first saw him. He was sitting on a fallen log, hands clasped loosely between his knees, watching the lake. Early 20s, maybe older, dark hair, lanky build, wearing a faded blue t-shirt and cargo shorts. At first, he just looked like any other camper, maybe someone waiting for a friend to finish fishing. But when he saw us, his head tilted slightly, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You guys headed to the lake?" he asked. His voice was friendly, casual, the way an older brother might sound when teasing a younger sibling. Josh, always more outgoing than me, nodded. I just stood there, suddenly uncomfortable, staring at his bare feet. Something about him was off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "You want to hang out?" he asked. "Maybe go swimming?" I didn't want to. The way he looked at us, too focused, too interested, made my stomach feel tight. Josh hesitated, but I nudged his arm, and we both muttered some excuse before turning back toward camp. As we walked away, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still sitting there, watching us. We didn't talk about him once we got back. It wasn't until later that night, after dinner, when I was lying in my bunk staring at the ceiling, that I let myself think about how uneasy he'd made me feel. My parents were outside by the fire, talking in low voices, and Josh was already asleep on the bunk above mine. The camper's window was open, letting in the cool night air, the distant sounds of crickets and muffled voices from other campsites. I don't know what made me roll over and look outside. Maybe it was a noise. Maybe it was nothing at all. But when I did, my breath caught in my throat. He was there, standing right outside the window, barely 3 feet from my face. His expression was blank, his face pale in the moonlight. His hands hung at his sides, still as the trees behind him. For a moment, we just stared at each other, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I screamed. The sound jolted Josh awake and sent my parents scrambling inside. My dad flicked on the camper lights, groggy and annoyed, while my mom asked what was wrong. I couldn't do anything but point at the window. By then, of course, the man was gone. Dad sighed, grumbling about nightmares and overactive imaginations, but he pulled on his shoes and stepped outside anyway, walking around the camper with a flashlight. I stayed frozen in my bunk, eyes darting between the window and the doorway, waiting for him to come back. When he finally did, he shook his head. "No one's out there," he said. "Go back to sleep." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think I had imagined it, but I hadn't. I knew what I saw. The next morning, my dad, Still half convinced I'd had a bad dream, went to check around the campground. I tagged along, stomach twisted with unease. We asked the people at the neighboring sites if they'd seen anything unusual the night before. No one had. Then we walked down toward the lake. The spot where Josh and I had met him was empty. No camping gear, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But something about the way my dad's expression hardened told me he wasn't so sure anymore that I'd made it up. He didn't say much after that, just clapped a hand on my shoulder and told me to stick close to camp. We stayed one more night, but I barely slept, every creak of the camper making my heart race. The next morning, we packed up and left. I never saw him again, but for years afterward, I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't screamed, if I hadn't looked out the window at all. Some things I think you're just not meant to know. I had been on the road for months, traveling across the country, sleeping in the back of my truck when I was too tired to set up my tent, or in the teepee-style tent I had bought online when I wanted to stretch out more. It was a routine that had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Driving, hiking, camping, moving on to the next place. I liked the solitude. Being out there, far from everything, made the world feel simpler. That night, I had set up camp deep in a remote stretch of desert, about 15 or 20 miles from the nearest highway. The area was desolate, just how I liked it. The nearest campsite was far off, barely visible against the landscape. Their rig looked like a truck with a camper shell, but it was distant enough that I couldn't tell for sure. I never saw the occupants. The air was crisp, the kind of dry desert air that settles into your lungs like dust. The sky stretched out endlessly, a dark canvas riddled with stars. Felt peaceful. I set up my tent on a flat patch of earth near some rock formations that would shield me from the wind. My truck was parked close, so if I needed to grab something in the middle of the night, I wouldn't have far to go. I had a small cook stove where I heated up a can of chili, eating straight from the pot as I listened to the night settle in. A few coyotes yipped in the distance, their howls echoing through the valley, but otherwise, the silence was thick. After cleaning up, I crawled into my tent and onto my cot, wrapped up tight in my sleeping bag. I drifted off easily, lulled by the quiet. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me up, the kind of half-conscious moment where your mind isn't entirely caught up with reality yet. Then I heard it again, a faint, whirring noise, like fingers lightly tracing against nylon. It wasn't the wind. The night had been still when I'd gone to sleep. I held my breath and listened. The sound moved, shifting position around my tent. A dragging sensation like fingertips running in slow, deliberate strokes over the thin fabric. I stayed completely still. Something or someone was outside. The noise circled me, slow, unhurried. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. The tent walls were thin. Whatever was out there was only inches away from me. I listened for footsteps but didn't hear any. Only that odd, unsettling sound of something gliding over the nylon. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid whoever was out there would hear it. I don't know how long it went on. Time stretched, every second feeling like a full minute. 10 minutes, maybe more. Then suddenly it stopped. I laid there in the silence, waiting. Every muscle in my body was tense. I strained to hear something, anything. After what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe, let myself think that maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. 15 minutes passed, maybe more. My body stayed rigid, ears attuned to every sound outside. And then, the tent collapsed. The sudden weight pushed down over me, smothering the space. The cot shifted under me as the tent fabric crumpled. A small center support held it at an angle, but my world was suddenly pitched into darkness. Nylon pressing in on all sides. My instincts kicked in. My hands shot to the zipper, ripping it open. I burst out into the cold night air, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I scrambled toward my truck. I didn't look back, didn't try to make sense of it, just ran. I threw myself into the truck bed, locking the topper from the inside. My firearm was within reach, and I grabbed it, hands shaking as I settled against the side of the truck, staring out into the night through the darkened windows. Nothing moved. I stayed like that, rigid with adrenaline, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally bled into the sky, I cautiously stepped out of the truck. The cold morning air bit at my skin as I moved toward my collapsed tent. My cook stove was overturned, my cot half buried under the tent fabric. I stood there for a moment, scanning the landscape, feeling the eerie weight of the night still pressing down on me. Then I saw them, footprints, circling my tent in the loose dirt. They weren't mine. I crouched, examining them. They were from boots, the pattern sharp and defined, pointed at the toe like cowboy boots. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there when I'd set up camp the evening before, and they circled my tent multiple times before wandering off into the valley. I followed them for a few yards before stopping. They led away from camp, fading into the vast, empty desert. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the horizon. I packed up quickly. My hands felt clumsy as I stuffed my tent into the back of the truck, tossing in my gear without care for organization. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to. The morning air was crisp, the sun beginning its slow rise over the valley, but I felt exposed. As I drove away, the image of those boot prints stuck with me. Someone had been out there, watching, circling. I had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, camping in places far more remote than this, but I had never felt anything like the unease that settled deep in my gut that morning. I never went back to that place. Even now, years later, when I set up my tent in a quiet stretch of wilderness, I can't shake the memory. The sound of something dragging over the nylon, the weight of the tent collapsing over me, the footprints in the dirt. Every night I camp, I find myself listening, waiting, and hoping that, wherever they were that night, they never come back. The summer I turned 13, I attended a week-long camp with my church. It was held deep in the woods, far from any town, the kind of place where the nights were black as ink, and the only sounds came from the wind stirring the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was my first time being away from home for so long, and I was excited. Campfires, hiking, swimming in the lake. It was exactly the kind of adventure I wanted. The first night was normal. My cabin was a small wooden structure, nestled with others in a clearing. I shared it with 5 other girls. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. We stayed up whispering after lights out, giggling about the cute counselors and daring each other to sneak out to the snack shed. The kind of innocent fun that comes with summer camp. But by the second night, everything changed. After a long day of activities, I needed to do some laundry. The only washer and dryer were in the nurse's cabin, a good 5-minute walk from where we slept. The camp was strict about permission, so I checked with my counselor before heading out. It was late, but I didn't think much of it. The nurse's cabin was at the edge of camp, near the woods. The path was dimly lit by scattered lamps, their light weak against the thick darkness. As I walked alone, the cool night air pricking at my damp skin from my earlier shower, a strange unease settled in my gut. The sensation came out of nowhere, crawling up my spine like icy fingers. I suddenly felt very, very aware of how quiet it was. Something told me not to turn around. Instead, I quickened my pace, my heartbeat picking up as I focused on the warm glow of the nurse's cabin ahead. I reached the porch, yanked the door open, and stepped inside. The air smelled of disinfectant and something slightly musty. The nurse barely looked up from her paperwork as I tossed my clothes into the washer. Then I made the mistake of glancing at the window. Outside, beyond the dim porch light, stood a figure, dressed as a clown. My breath hitched, my body locking in place. The clown's face was pale, almost unnatural under the glow of the lamp. The smile stretched too wide, the painted mouth curling up as if it were grinning directly at me. He, because it had to be a man, stood completely still, just staring. I sucked in a sharp breath and yanked the curtain closed. My hands trembled. I wanted to say something, to tell the nurse, but my throat was dry. Surely someone dressed like that had to be playing a prank? Maybe one of the older boys messing around? I forced myself to stay calm, finishing my laundry. When I asked if I could stay until morning, the nurse barely glanced at me before shaking her head. I had no choice but to walk back. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the area. He was gone. Still, my stomach churned as I hurried along the path. The air felt heavier now, the darkness pressing in tighter. Every rustling branch made me flinch. My feet moved fast, my breathing uneven. When I reached the steps of my cabin, something compelled me to glance across the clearing. There he was, but not as a clown this time. Dressed in all black, wearing a mask with the same haunting grin. He stood at the far edge of camp, just beyond the trees. He was pointing at me. I darted inside, bolted the door, and crawled into bed, my heart still hammering. I didn't tell the other girls. Couldn't. Who would believe me? It had to be a joke. A stupid, terrifying joke. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. We woke up early, just a handful of us who didn't want to miss breakfast. The sun was barely rising as we grabbed towels and walked to the showers. I was the third to finish, drying off as the other girls dressed. I reached for my clothes, folded neatly on the sink. Then I felt it. Presence. Slowly, I lifted my gaze to the mirror. He was there, standing just outside the back door, his masked face pressed against the glass. But this time, something was different. He looked startled, as if he hadn't expected me to see him. Our eyes locked for a second, then he turned and ran. I whipped around, my chest heaving, but he was already gone. I told the other girls, but they just gave me blank looks. No one had seen him. No one understood. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. The final night of camp was supposed to be a celebration. We had a big bonfire, music, and games. The mood was light, the fear of the past nights dulling under the warmth of the fire, until I saw him again, standing near the tree line, just beyond the reach of the firelight. He wasn't wearing the mask this time, but I knew it was him. Tall, dark clothes, watching me. Then he moved his hand, beckoning me. I felt something snap inside me. Fear turned to anger. I shot to my feet and pointed, my voice loud and firm. "Intruder!" Heads turned. People gasped. But the second I shouted, he took off, disappearing into the woods near the lake. Counselors ran after him, but they never found him. Not that night. Not ever. I never went anywhere alone again. Never walked in the dark without checking over my shoulder. And I never, ever returned to that camp. Some nightmares fade with time. This one didn't. The summer I turned 13, I attended a week-long camp with my church. It was held deep in the woods, far from any town, the kind of place where the nights were black as ink, and the only sounds came from the wind stirring the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was my first time being away from home for so long, and I was excited. Campfires, hiking, swimming in the lake. It was exactly the kind of adventure I wanted. The first night was normal. My cabin was a small wooden structure, nestled with others in a clearing. I shared it with 5 other girls. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. We stayed up whispering after lights out, giggling about the cute counselors and daring each other to sneak out to the snack shed. The kind of innocent fun that comes with summer camp. But by the second night, everything changed. After a long day of activities, I needed to do some laundry. The only washer and dryer were in the nurse's cabin, a good 5-minute walk from where we slept. The camp was strict about permission, so I checked with my counselor before heading out. It was late, but I didn't think much of it. The nurse's cabin was at the edge of camp, near the woods. The path was dimly lit by scattered lamps, their light weak against the thick darkness. As I walked alone, the cool night air pricking at my damp skin from my earlier shower, a strange unease settled in my gut. The sensation came out of nowhere, crawling up my spine like icy fingers. I suddenly felt very, very aware of how quiet it was. Something told me not to turn around. Instead, I quickened my pace, my heartbeat picking up as I focused on the warm glow of the nurse's cabin ahead. I reached the porch, yanked the door open, and stepped inside. The air smelled of disinfectant and something slightly musty. The nurse barely looked up from her paperwork as I tossed my clothes into the washer. Then I made the mistake of glancing at the window. Outside, beyond the dim porch light, stood a figure, dressed as a clown. My breath hitched, my body locking in place. The clown's face was pale, almost unnatural under the glow of the lamp. The smile stretched too wide, the painted mouth curling up as if it were grinning directly at me. He, because it had to be a man, stood completely still, just staring. I sucked in a sharp breath and yanked the curtain closed. My hands trembled. I wanted to say something, to tell the nurse, but my throat was dry. Surely someone dressed like that had to be playing a prank? Maybe one of the older boys messing around? I forced myself to stay calm, finishing my laundry. When I asked if I could stay until morning, the nurse barely glanced at me before shaking her head. I had no choice but to walk back. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the area. He was gone. Still, my stomach churned as I hurried along the path. The air felt heavier now, the darkness pressing in tighter. Every rustling branch made me flinch. My feet moved fast, my breathing uneven. When I reached the steps of my cabin, something compelled me to glance across the clearing. There he was, but not as a clown this time. Dressed in all black, wearing a mask with the same haunting grin. He stood at the far edge of camp, just beyond the trees. He was pointing at me. I darted inside, bolted the door, and crawled into bed, my heart still hammering. I didn't tell the other girls. Couldn't. Who would believe me? It had to be a joke. A stupid, terrifying joke. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. We woke up early, just a handful of us who didn't want to miss breakfast. The sun was barely rising as we grabbed towels and walked to the showers. I was the third to finish, drying off as the other girls dressed. I reached for my clothes, folded neatly on the sink. Then I felt it. Presence. Slowly, I lifted my gaze to the mirror. He was there, standing just outside the back door, his masked face pressed against the glass. But this time, something was different. He looked startled, as if he hadn't expected me to see him. Our eyes locked for a second, then he turned and ran. I whipped around, my chest heaving, but he was already gone. I told the other girls, but they just gave me blank looks. No one had seen him. No one understood. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. The final night of camp was supposed to be a celebration. We had a big bonfire, music, and games. The mood was light, the fear of the past nights dulling under the warmth of the fire, until I saw him again, standing near the tree line, just beyond the reach of the firelight. He wasn't wearing the mask this time, but I knew it was him. Tall, dark clothes, watching me. Then he moved his hand, beckoning me. I felt something snap inside me. Fear turned to anger. I shot to my feet and pointed, my voice loud and firm. "Intruder!" Heads turned. People gasped. But the second I shouted, he took off, disappearing into the woods near the lake. Counselors ran after him, but they never found him. Not that night. Not ever. I never went anywhere alone again. Never walked in the dark without checking over my shoulder. And I never, ever returned to that camp. Some nightmares fade with time. This one didn't. It was early fall, the kind of day where the sun still carried warmth, but the shade held a creeping chill. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the woods hummed with the background noise of birds, rustling branches, and the occasional distant call of a raven. A friend and I had decided to take a short walk on one of the main trails at a state park, just to stretch our legs before heading deeper into the backcountry later that day. We weren't even far from the parking lot, maybe a 5-minute walk in, when something shifted. The air changed first. It became heavier, dense, like a buildup before a summer storm. It carried a strange electric charge that made my forehead tingle. I stopped walking, frowning slightly, trying to place the sensation. My friend didn't say anything but raised his arm, showing the hair on his forearm standing straight up. He must have felt it too. We weren't spooked yet, just unsettled. But then our attention was drawn, almost instinctively, to a narrow game trail just off the main path. It wound about 20 feet into the underbrush before curving out of sight. There was no reason for us to focus on it. It was just another deer trail. But we did. The stillness of the area struck me next. It wasn't silent, but something felt off. The usual layering of sound in the woods, distant movement, birds calling to each other, the rustling of small animals, seemed thinner, like it had been stripped down to only the most basic elements. I didn't say anything, neither did my friend, but he took a sudden step forward, as if pulled toward the game trail. Then another. He wasn't running, just moving with purpose, almost like he wanted to prove that nothing was there. And then it happened. The sound of something massive crashing down, something big, hitting the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath us, came from just past the bend in the game trail. My chest tightened, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I didn't move. I was too locked in by the sheer impossibility of what I was experiencing. Branches snapping, underbrush crushing under what sounded like enormous weight, a deep, almost rhythmic pounding. Something was charging, fast, right at us. It lasted maybe 2-3 seconds at most. The kind of sound that makes your heart seize up in terror before your brain even has time to process it. The ground trembled beneath my feet. My breath hitched. My friend stumbled back a step. Then nothing. No movement. No breathing. No wind. The game trail was completely still. I could see straight down to where the bend disappeared into the trees, and there was nothing. Not a single branch was swaying. Not a single leaf out of place. We stood frozen, every nerve in my body on high alert, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had just happened. A bear? An elk? Had we startled something big enough to charge us? It had sounded massive, but there was no sign of movement, no bushes shaking, no dust settling. The only sound was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then the birds started again, a slow, hesitant chirping, as if they were testing the air. The tension in my chest eased slightly, but the unease remained. I finally exhaled, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. My friend, still silent, took a cautious step back onto the main trail, not turning his back to the game trail until we were a good 15 feet away. We didn't talk much on the way back to the parking lot. What was there to say? It wasn't like we could rationalize it. The sound had been real. The ground had shaken, but there had been nothing there. For days afterward, I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there had been an animal and we just hadn't seen it, but even that explanation didn't sit right, because for all the noise and force we'd experienced, not a single piece of the landscape had moved. Still bothers me. I've spent plenty of time outdoors, and I know what an animal moving through the brush sounds like. I know how a charging elk or a startled bear should behave. This wasn't that. It wasn't normal. It wasn't anything I can explain. The road to the campsite was rough, a twisting dirt track carved through the dense, dry forest. We had been driving for hours, pushing deeper into the wilderness, looking for a place to spend the night. The plan was simple: camp out, do some hiking the next day, and enjoy a weekend away from civilization. It was me, my husband, his mother, and an old family friend. We weren't new to camping, far from it. We had all spent plenty of time outdoors, but this area was unfamiliar to us. It was late summer, the air thick with heat. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. We hadn't passed another vehicle in at least an hour, and when my husband finally pulled off the road into a clearing near some jagged rock formations, I was relieved. I was tired. At first glance, the site looked fine. A little too quiet, maybe, but pretty. The rock formations loomed like the weathered bones of the earth, sharp and strange against the sky. The trees formed a natural barrier around the clearing, offering some shelter from the wind. There was a fire ring half buried in dirt, evidence that people had camped here before. But then I started noticing things, small, scattered details that unsettled me. Near the fire ring, there was a pile of half-eaten hot dogs, long since dried out under the sun. A few feet away, a leather gun holster sat abandoned, its buckle broken. Beside it, a dog collar worn, the name tag scratched beyond recognition. I told myself it was nothing. People leave things behind all the time, but something about it felt wrong. I wasn't the only one who thought so. No one said anything outright, but I could tell from the way my husband's mother kept glancing around that she felt it too. The family friend, an old-school outdoorsman who prided himself on being unshakable, seemed unusually quiet. But we were here and it was late. We set up camp. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. I listened to the wind shift through the trees, the occasional rustle of underbrush. But there were no animal sounds, no insects chirping, no distant calls of night birds, just stillness. By morning, none of us felt like lingering. We packed up and left, finding another site about 10 miles away. The second spot wasn't anything special, but at least it felt normal. 2 days passed without incident. We hiked, made campfires, talked late into the night, and then, as we were heading back to civilization, we hit unexpected traffic. The highway was backed up, something that made no sense in such a remote area. As we crawled forward, we saw flashing lights, police cars, park rangers, a single vehicle marked with CBI. They waved us over. A uniformed officer approached the car, his expression unreadable. He asked where we had been camping. My husband told him about the first sight, about the strange things we had found. The officer's face barely changed, but I caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He waved us on. Weeks later, I saw the news. A woman's body had been found near where we camped that first night. Murdered, dismembered, burned in an oil drum. It was a targeted killing, the article said. The suspects had been caught, but the details didn't matter. All I could think about was that clearing, the silence, the uneasy feeling that had settled in my bones the moment we arrived. I never camped there again. The first time I laid eyes on the stretch of river where we set up camp, I felt a sense of uneasy excitement. It was a raw, isolated beauty, the kind that made you feel like you had truly escaped. My partner and I had been traveling for work, doing a workaway stint that took us through some of the more remote areas of the state. This particular place was about 40 minutes from the nearest real town, a winding drive through dense forest and rough back roads that finally spit us out near a wide, stony riverbank. It was a public use area, which meant people could camp for free, and there were a few others scattered around the area. Some of the camps looked like they had been there a long time. There were a couple of weathered RVs parked deeper in the trees, their windows covered in thick tarps or sheets. They didn't look like the kind of weekend camper setups we were used to seeing. More like semi-permanent homes, the kind people hunker down in when they don't want to be found. Still, we found a nice, tucked away spot away from everyone else, set up our tent, and settled in. Felt remote, but not unsafe. That changed as night fell. Around 10:30, we heard an engine grinding slowly over the rough trail leading into the area. It was a tricky road, all deep ruts and loose gravel, so the vehicle moved at a crawl. It took nearly 10 minutes for it to reach the riverbank, where the other campers were. From our spot, we could just make out the shape of an older model sedan creeping through the makeshift campground, stopping and starting in odd intervals. It was unusual. Most people arriving that late had a reason. Either they were coming in to set up camp themselves, or they were meeting someone already here. But this car just idled and rolled, its headlights flicking around like the driver was searching for something. Paused for long stretches, the engine rumbling, before creeping forward again. We watched in silence from our tent, unsure what to make of it. It finally parked about 30 yards away. 2 figures got out, but in the dim light, we couldn't make out much about them. They just stood by the car, talking quietly to each other. They weren't setting up a tent, unloading gear, or doing anything that suggested they were here to camp. They were just there. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. There were other people camped in the area. We weren't completely alone. Still, something about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, kept my nerves on edge. My partner and I exchanged a glance but didn't say anything. Eventually, we convinced ourselves we were being paranoid and crawled into the tent to get some rest. We had barely settled when we heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. The sound was close, too close. The car had moved. It was now right next to our tent. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The engine was idling just feet away. There was no reason for them to be here, We had picked a spot off the main area, specifically to be away from the scattered RVs and camps. No one should have driven up here unless they were looking for us. My stomach clenched as I fumbled for the can of bear spray I always kept nearby. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, as I unzipped the tent just enough to see. The car was so close that I could see the dull glow of the dashboard lights through the windshield. 2 figures sat inside, unmoving. I forced myself up, pushing through the fear gripping my chest. The second I stood, the car lurched into reverse. Tires spun against loose gravel, and the vehicle shot backward, retreating just as suddenly as it had arrived. It didn't leave, though. It pulled back about 60 yards and stopped again, facing us with its headlights on. By now, my heart was hammering. They weren't just lost. They weren't just looking for a camping spot. They had pulled right up to us, sat there, and only backed off when they saw movement. Now, they were watching us. Midnight crept closer, and they still hadn't left. The headlights stayed fixed on our campsite, the engine still humming faintly. We sat there, barely breathing, staring back. I tried to come up with rational explanations, but none of them fit. It was too deliberate, too unnatural. We weren't about to find out what they wanted. As quietly as possible, we began breaking camp. We didn't bother packing everything properly, just shoved the essentials into the car, adrenaline making our movements quick and clumsy. The tent was still half-staked when I yanked it free, rolling it up in a messy bundle and tossing it into the back seat. My partner kept watch as I climbed into the driver's seat, hands slick with sweat against the steering wheel. I started the car. The other vehicle didn't move. We pulled out onto the rough trail, leaving the campsite behind. Only then did the other car react. It flicked off its headlights, going completely dark. I caught one last glimpse of it in the rearview mirror, sitting there like a predator that had just lost its prey. We didn't stop driving until we were back on the highway. It was only then that the full weight of what had happened sank in. We had no idea who those people were or what they wanted. Maybe they were just messing with us. Maybe they had other intentions. Either way, we hadn't stuck around to find out. The wilderness comes with its dangers: bears, weather, the risk of injury miles away from help. But that night cemented something I had always known deep down. The scariest thing you can run into out there isn't an animal. It's another person. The hike had started off exactly as planned. 3 days in the backcountry of a state park, close enough to civilization that we had phone signal in some spots, but isolated enough to feel like we had escaped the noise of the world. We weren't deep in the wilderness. This wasn't a remote, untamed place. But out here, surrounded by trees, creeks, and rocky ridgelines, it was easy to imagine we were far from anyone. The first day had been long, the trail winding through dense brush before climbing up into pine forest. We made good time and reached the campsite by late afternoon. It was a designated hike-in site marked on maps but not accessible by car, at least not officially. A narrow fire access road cut through the trees about 50 yards from the clearing where we set up camp. It was the only sign that vehicles ever came near this place. No one else was there, just the two of us, our tents pitched a few feet apart, and the quiet hush of the woods settling into evening. We ate dinner, filtered water from the creek, and sat up talking until the last of the light drained from the sky. The air turned cool, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs as I crawled into my tent. I remember feeling calm, content, safe. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the rustling leaves and the distant trickle of water. Then came the barking. It jolted me awake, sharp and sudden. Not close, but not far either. A deep, aggressive bark, echoing through the trees. My first thought was that someone was hiking in with a dog. But then I heard the engine. A low, throaty growl. The sound of a vehicle working its way up a rough road. Headlights cut through the darkness beyond my tent, illuminating the tree trunks in a sickly yellow glow. The engine idled, then revved. Gravel crunched as the vehicle came to a stop. I stayed still, listening. The barking continued, punctuated by the heavy thud of paws hitting the ground. The dog had jumped down. Then came voices. Men talking loudly, their words slurred at the edges. Laughter, cursing, the clang of metal on metal. I held my breath, waiting. The voices grew louder. Footsteps crunched closer. I heard my friend shift in her tent, the faint rustling of fabric as she moved. We had no way to communicate without making noise, but I knew she was awake, knew she was hearing this too. The dog padded closer, sniffing, its nails clicking against the rocks near our tents. My stomach clenched. If the dog found us interesting enough, would its owners come looking? Would they walk over, find two women alone in the dark? The metallic clanging continued. Heavy, deliberate thuds, as if they were unloading equipment. A splash, something hitting the creek. More swearing, more banging. I strained to make out what they were saying, but the words were broken, overlapping, carried away by the night air. One of them sounded angry, another laughed. Then, a scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. They were in the creek, doing something, digging. The thought sent a cold shiver through me. My friend and I had hiked this area for years, and neither of us had ever encountered anyone panning for gold. But that's what it sounded like. The scraping, the splashing, the way they moved through the water. I lay still, forcing slow, shallow breaths. If they didn't know we were here, they had no reason to come looking. If we stayed silent, they might finish whatever they were doing and leave. The dog circled my tent again, sniffed, huffed, then trotted off toward the creek. I could hear them more clearly now. One man was complaining about the water being too low. Another told him to shut up and keep working. Something clattered against rock, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Shit! The word rang out, followed by a string of curses. Then more laughter, uneven and breathless. I didn't need to see them to know one of them was hurt. More splashing, more grumbling. Then, finally, the sound I had been hoping for, the engine roaring back to life. The headlights swung around, illuminating the trees in long, shifting shadows. The dog barked again, a few quick, excited yaps, before the sound of paws scrambling into the truck bed. The vehicle idled for a moment, then rumbled back down the fire road, the noise fading into the distance. Silence settled over the forest again. Not the peaceful quiet from before, but a heavy, smothering stillness. I let out a slow breath, listened, waited. Then I heard my friend move, the soft rustle of fabric, the faint creak of a sleeping pad shifting under weight. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. I knew she had been just as frozen, just as terrified. The night was still long, and neither of us would be sleeping much. When dawn finally came, we packed up quickly, our movements stiff with exhaustion. In the daylight, the campsite looked the same as it had before. The trees still stood tall, the creek still ran clear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been disturbed, that the woods had been marked by those men in some way we couldn't see. We crossed the creek, stepping carefully over the slick rocks, and found their footprints in the mud. Deep impressions, scattered and careless. Not just boot prints, paw prints too. Big ones. The thought of that dog sniffing around our tents sent another wave of unease through me. How close had it gotten? How close had they? My friend exhaled, staring down at the tracks. I thought they were burying a body, she admitted finally, voice tight. I shook my head, still watching the water flow past. They were panning for gold. The words felt strange, surreal. What kind of person sneaks into a state park to pan for gold in the dead of night? Why risk a fine? Why do it in the dark? Neither of us had an answer, but we both knew we weren't staying another night. The second we were back on the trail, putting distance between us and that sight, I felt the weight lift. The forest no longer felt like it was holding its breath. The further we walked, the more the tension faded. We didn't stop until we reached the next designated campsite, 1 mile away, with no fire roads nearby. A place where, hopefully, no one would come looking for gold in the middle of the night. That experience became part of our hiking lore. We told the story often, laughing about it over campfires and beers. But there was always an edge to it, a quiet understanding between us that it hadn't really been funny at the time. Because for those long, silent minutes in the dark, we hadn't known what those men were doing. and for a little while we had both believed we were about to find out the worst way possible. The dirt road was rough, winding down toward the river in deep ruts and loose gravel, the kind of path that had clearly seen just enough traffic to stay passable but not enough to be maintained. The sun was dipping low behind the canyon walls, streaking the sky in burnt orange and deepening purple, and we were getting desperate. We were 2 moms, 6 kids, and a loaded SUV crawling down the road, searching for a place to set up camp before dark. Our plan had been simple: find a spot near the water, set up quick, and get everyone fed before exhaustion set in. Dispersed camping was supposed to be an adventure, something to give the kids stories to tell. But as the minutes ticked by, unease settled in. There was no one else out here. No other campers, no headlights in the distance, no flickering fires. Just the sound of tires crunching gravel and the wind cutting through the brush. Then we saw it. At first, it was a relief, a site already set up. A tan Jeep parked to the side, a tent pitched, a small folding table and a single chair. But the relief curdled into confusion as we got closer. The tent flap hung open, its interior dark, filled with camping gear. A plate of what looked like chili sat on the table, now a hardened, moldy crust. A dog bowl lay beside it, old kibble turned to mush in a stagnant puddle of water. No movement, no sound, no people. I put the car in park. The kids were already restless, whining about food, but something about the stillness of the place made my skin prickle. I stepped out, boots crunching on dry dirt, scanning the area for any sign of life. No footprints in the dust, no dog tracks, no sign that anyone had been here recently, and yet the setup was fresh. Not weeks abandoned, but days at most. The tent wasn't collapsed. The food hadn't been scavenged by animals. It was as if someone had just stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. Every hair on my body stood on end. The other mom, Sarah, stepped out beside me, her face mirroring my own unease. Neither of us spoke, but we didn't need to. We both felt it. Something was wrong. We got back in the car, locked the doors, and drove. We didn't stop until we had cell service again, a few miles up the road. It took some bouncing between cell towers, but eventually we got through to the county sheriff. They asked for the location, details, if we had seen anyone, if there was any sign of a struggle. No, we answered. Just an abandoned campsite that felt wrong. By then, the kids were at their limit, hungry, cranky, done. It was too late to keep searching for another site, and we needed to set up somewhere safe. So we drove back up the road about 6 miles, found a clearing well away from the river, and made camp. We cooked, we ate, we tried to shake the feeling. The kids at least settled quickly. Lanterns glowed warm against the trees as the stars came out, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. Then the sheriff's vehicles rumbled past, headlights bouncing in the dark. We waved as they went by, 2 SUVs heading down toward the site, but they didn't stop, didn't even slow, just disappeared into the night. We expected them to come back and tell us what they found. Instead, 2 hours later, their headlights swept past again, heading back toward town. No pause, no acknowledgement, nothing. Sarah and I exchanged a look, but neither of us spoke our thoughts aloud. We didn't want to spook the kids. We turned in for the night. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was deep into the night, the kind of dark where the stars feel close enough to touch. The wind had died down and the night was still, too still. Then the sounds came, distant, yipping howls. Coyotes, a normal enough sound in the wilderness, something I'd heard plenty of times before. But there was something off about it. A pattern I couldn't place, a timing that felt too deliberate. I lay still, listening. Then, another sound. Footsteps, heavy ones. Not the quick, light patter of coyotes, but the deliberate crunch of boots on dirt. Slow, measured, close. I barely breathed. Beside me, Sarah stirred. I knew she heard it too, but neither of us moved. The kids were silent, asleep, blissfully unaware. The footsteps circled. Once, twice, then a pause. A long one. I strained to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. The night stretched impossibly long. Then finally, nothing. Just the wind picking up again, rustling the trees. I don't know how long I lay awake, but eventually, exhaustion won. Dawn came slow, the first light creeping through the trees. The kids woke, groggy but cheerful, unaware that anything had been wrong. I stepped outside, and my stomach dropped. Boot prints, large, heavy hiking boots, circling the tent, and dog tracks. Not coyote prints, these were deeper, distinct. A large dog moving alongside those boots. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No other campers, no hikers, no rangers. No reason except that abandoned camp. We packed up faster than I ever had in my life. No one spoke of staying another night. No one hesitated. We loaded the kids, the gear, everything, and we got the hell out of there. I had been on the road for months, traveling the country, living out of the back of my truck, or sleeping in a teepee-style tent I'd bought online. It was a cheap setup, but it did the job. I was somewhere in the high desert, far off the main highway, a good 15 to 20 miles from any sign of civilization. The spot was remote, peaceful, and exactly what I was looking for. A quiet night under the stars with nothing but the open landscape surrounding me. There was only one other vehicle at the campsite, a large rig parked well over 100 yards away, far enough that I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of the camper against the horizon. No lights were on, no signs of movement. Felt like I had the whole place to myself. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. I cooked a simple meal on my little propane stove, the warmth of the food spreading through my chest as I sat on a fold-out chair next to the tent. There was something comforting about being so alone out here, the silence only broken by the occasional gust of wind that rustled through the dry desert brush. After finishing up, I put my stove away, made sure my truck was locked up tight, and crawled into my tent for the night. It was one of those evenings where you fall asleep instantly, exhaustion from the long day catching up with you. But at some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, just that something felt off. I lay still, my ears straining against the silence, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a soft whirring sound, like something dragging across nylon. My heart started to hammer in my chest. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of fingers or something like fingers trailing along the side of my tent. Slowly, deliberately, my mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe the wind? An animal? But the sound was too controlled, too purposeful. Whatever was out there was moving, circling me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, muscles locked in place, listening. The sound continued, shifting to another side of the tent, then another, as if whoever or whatever it was taking their time, exploring. I gripped the handle of my knife, my fingers tight around it, my body tensed and waiting. It had to be an animal, I told myself, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't the way an animal moved. Minutes passed, long, unbearable minutes. The sound would stop, then start again, sometimes closer, sometimes further. Then suddenly silence. I lay there, every muscle in my body rigid, my breath shallow. I waited, forcing myself to count in my head to calm my nerves. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was just exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me? Then, without warning, my tent collapsed. It happened fast, the entire structure caving in around me as the center pole buckled at an angle, pressing the fabric down against my body. I panicked, thrashing under the weight, my mind screaming at me to move. I fought my way toward the opening, clawing at the zipper with trembling hands. The second I got it open, I bolted. I sprinted straight for my truck, my boots kicking up dust as I ran. I didn't stop, didn't turn around. I lunged for the tailgate, yanked it open, and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the locks, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Only then did I dare to look out the window. The tent lay in a heap, the fabric tangled, the poles bent at odd angles. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of whatever had been out there. I grabbed my firearm from my pack, my hands still shaking as I sat in the darkness, heart pounding in my ears. I stayed like that for hours, my back against the truck bed, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep again that night. When the first hints of sunrise painted the sky, I finally worked up the nerve to step outside. My breath fogged in the cold morning air as I walked cautiously toward my tent. Everything was as I had left it, my stove and cot still in place. But the ground told a different story. Footprints. They circled my tent over and over. Not animal tracks, but boot prints. And not mine. I knelt down, studying them. They were deep in the dirt, meaning whoever had made them had been standing there for a while. The shape was unmistakable, pointed at the toe, narrow. Cowboy boots. The prints wove in a slow, methodical loop around my tent, overlapping themselves as if whoever it was had been pacing, watching. Then, finally, they led off into the desert, disappearing into the valley beyond. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, throwing everything into the truck without bothering to be neat about it. I didn't care if I left something behind, I just needed to go. I drove out of that campsite and never looked back. To this day, I don't know who was out there that night or what their intentions were. I don't know if they were just messing with me or if it was something worse. But I do know one thing, whoever it was, they were real. And they had been watching me for hours. I haven't camped in a tent since. I should have known better than to go up there alone. It had been years since I last stayed at the old family cabin, a two-room structure deep in the woods, built decades ago by my grandfather. It wasn't anything special. A wooden frame, a tin roof, and a stone fireplace, but it held memories. Good ones, or at least they used to be. I told myself that's why I was going, to reconnect with something simpler. No cell service, no electricity, just me, the trees, and the quiet. But maybe I was lying to myself. Maybe I just wanted to prove that I could still do it. The road leading up was a mess of potholes and overgrown branches. I had to park the truck half a mile down the trail because a fallen tree blocked the path. By the time I hauled my gear up the last stretch, sweat soaked through my shirt. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was quiet, too quiet. I had expected to hear birds or the rustling of small animals, but the only sounds came from my own movements. The cabin looked the same, though the wood had darkened with time. The porch creaked under my boots as I tested the planks. Still sturdy. I unlocked the door and shoved it open, the musty air hitting me instantly. It smelled of old wood, dust, and something else. Something faint but sour. Probably an animal had gotten in at some point. I checked the corners for signs of rodents or raccoons, but everything seemed undisturbed. I set down my gear, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and got to work. First was checking the food supplies I had brought. Canned goods, some jerky, dried fruit. Then the firewood. There was still a neat pile stacked against the back wall. I built a small fire to cut the dampness and let it burn low while I walked the perimeter of the property. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with old growth, dense with brush. No trails, no signs of recent human activity. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back toward the cabin, my stomach tight. That night, I woke to a sound. A snap, sharp and deliberate, somewhere outside. I lay still, ears straining, but the forest had gone silent again. No wind, no crickets, just that thick, heavy quiet. I reached for my flashlight, my hand stiff with unease, and clicked it on. The beam hit the walls, the floor, the single window facing the woods. Nothing. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Nothing came. The fire had burned down to embers by then, and exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, I found tracks in the soft dirt near the cabin. Not animal tracks, footprints, barefoot, the size of an adult's foot, but distorted, as if whoever left them had moved strangely, dragging or limping. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the woods. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows, maybe even my own footprints from yesterday. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day gathering firewood, stacking it inside instead of leaving it out back. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, though I knew a determined person or thing could break through if they really wanted to. The feeling of being watched never left me. It stayed, a weight pressing against my skin, making every movement feel sluggish and unnatural. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going. Every now and then, I thought I heard something just beyond the window. Movement, breathing. But when I shined the flashlight outside, the woods looked empty. On the third night, the knocking started. Soft at first, a deliberate tap, tap, tap against the cabin wall. I froze. It wasn't a branch scraping in the wind. It wasn't an animal nosing around. It was deliberate, human. I held my breath, heart hammering. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. Then it came again, this time against the window. A soft, almost curious sound, like fingers testing the glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was inside. They were waiting, watching. The next knock was louder, more forceful. Then came another and another, a slow, rhythmic pattern moving along the cabin wall. I gripped the flashlight, flicking it on and shining it at the window. Nothing was there. The knocking stopped. I barely slept that night. I kept the hatchet by my bedroll, the fire stoked high. The air inside felt heavy, thick with something unseen but real, something I could feel pressing in around me. At dawn, I packed my gear. I didn't care if it was early. I didn't care if I had planned to stay longer. I wasn't staying another night. As I stepped onto the porch, I stopped cold. More footprints. This time, they weren't just circling the cabin. They were everywhere, leading to the door, the windows, the firewood pile. Some were pressed so deep into the earth, I knew whoever made them had stood there for a long time, just waiting. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail. My heart pounded with every step, expecting at any moment to hear something behind me. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I threw everything in the back and sped off down the dirt road, bouncing over potholes, snapping branches as I went. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, miles away. Only then did I risk a glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just trees and dust. No movement, no figures standing at the edge of the woods. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that slow, deliberate knocking. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive had been long and lonely, winding up dirt roads that barely looked maintained. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and I had been relying on a printed map, one of those cheap gas station ones with barely any detail. The rental listing described the place as a rustic retreat in the mountains, perfect for solitude. That was what I wanted, just a few days alone, away from everything. No work, no emails, no people, just quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure with a steeply slanted roof, weathered wooden walls, and a sagging front porch. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where previous guests must have parked. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a crispness that only came with high-altitude forests. There were no other buildings in sight, just thick trees pressing in from all sides. Inside, the cabin was basic. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen tucked into one corner, and a single bedroom in the back. The floors creaked under my boots, and the air had that stale, closed-up smell of a place that hadn't been lived in for a while. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, and the kitchen had a few mismatched dishes in the cabinets. Enough to get by for a few days. After unpacking my bags, I checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising. The listing had warned about that. Still, it made me uneasy. The thought of being completely cut off. I shook it off. This was what I wanted, peace. No distractions. I lit the wood stove, boiled some water for coffee, and settled in with a book as the night closed in around the cabin. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had just turned off the lantern and crawled into bed when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the rustling of an animal in the underbrush, but slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Heavy, measured. My first thought was a bear, maybe even a moose. I held still, listening. The steps stopped right outside the door. I waited, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. No snuffling, no scratching, no attempt to push the door open. Just silence. After a long minute, I convinced myself I was imagining things. The woods played tricks on people at night. Sounds carried strangely. I tried to sleep, but I kept jolting awake, ears straining for any noise. If there was something out there, it never made another sound. In the morning, I stepped outside, expecting to see animal tracks in the dirt. There was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No paw prints, no sign of movement. Just my own footprints from the night before. I checked around the cabin, searching for anything that might explain what I had heard. Nothing. The second night was worse. The footsteps returned, but this time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the pine needles and dried leaves. I sat up in bed, gripping my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I was too afraid of what I might see if I did. My breathing was too loud, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps circled once, twice, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. The creak of the porch boards, the unmistakable shift of weight. Something was standing right outside the door again. I barely slept. First light, I checked again. The dirt was undisturbed. No prints, no marks. It was as if nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I had heard. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to enjoy the day. I hiked a little, stayed close to the cabin. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. Until I found the knife. It wasn't mine. It was old, the wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. The blade was rusted, pitted with age, and it was stuck into the porch railing, driven deep into the wood. My stomach churned. Someone had been here. Someone had done this while I slept. I grabbed my keys, my bag, everything important, and threw it into the car. I didn't care if I had paid for another 2 nights. I wasn't staying. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. Dead. Panic set in. I was stranded. No cell service. No way to call for help. No one knew exactly where I was. I spent the next hour trying to get the car to start. Checking the battery, jiggling the cables, doing everything I knew how to do. Nothing worked. The sun was sinking. I was running out of time. I had to make a choice. Stay in the cabin for another night or start walking. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away. Maybe more. The thought of being out in the woods at night, alone, terrified me. But the thought of staying here, waiting for whatever was out there to come back, was worse. I packed my bag with essentials. A flashlight, a knife, some food, and a bottle of water. I locked the cabin door behind me, as if that would help. Then I started walking. The first mile was fine. The road was rough, but the moon was bright enough to see by. The trees crowded in, branches scraping together in the breeze. Every sound made me jump. I forced myself to keep moving. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I started walking faster. The footsteps quickened too. I broke into a run. My pulse was roaring in my ears. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat. When I finally dared to stop, everything was silent. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind through the trees. My legs were shaking. I could barely stand. I had no idea how far I had come. My only thought was to keep going. Sometime before dawn, I stumbled onto a paved road. Civilization. I almost sobbed with relief. An hour later, I flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened as I told him about the cabin, about the knife, about the footsteps. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. That cabin's been empty for years. Last guy that stayed there went missing. Never found him. I left my car. I left everything. I never went back. A week later, I checked the listing. It was gone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week in a remote cabin, alone, deep in the mountains. No people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything, the constant noise of the city, the stress of work, the pressure of daily life. I needed silence, a real silence, the kind you can only find far from civilization. The drive up was long and winding. The roads were narrow, barely maintained, and littered with potholes. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I realized how isolated I was. My cell service had cut out miles back, and I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The only signs of life were the occasional deer darting across the road and the birds circling in the gray sky above. The cabin sat at the end of an overgrown dirt path, almost hidden among the towering pines. It was smaller than I expected. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a lone window facing the dense trees. The wood was dark, weathered, and cracked in places, as if it had been sitting here for decades, untouched. I stepped out of my truck, the air immediately cooler than it had been in the valley below. A thick, damp smell of earth and pine filled my lungs. It was silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no planes overhead, just stillness. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A wood-burning stove, a sagging couch, a small kitchen with a rusted sink. There was a single bedroom in the back with a narrow bed and a window covered in dust. A few old hunting magazines were stacked on a rickety wooden table. It looked like no one had been here in years. I spent the first day settling in, chopping firewood, and taking a short hike before dusk. When the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and read by lantern light. It was exactly what I needed, just me and the quiet. Then, at some point in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was something else, a feeling, like the air had changed, thickened somehow. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the walls. I couldn't hear anything outside, but something felt off. I sat up slowly. The old mattress creaked beneath me. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam around the small room. Nothing, just the same worn furniture, the same cracked walls. Then I noticed it, the front door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I remembered twisting the bolt, testing it to make sure it was secure. But now it was slightly ajar, just an inch or two, enough to see the darkness beyond it. A chill ran down my spine. I got up carefully, keeping the flashlight pointed at the door. My boots were by the bed. I slipped them on, feeling my pulse quicken. I reached for the hatchet I had used to split wood earlier that day and gripped it tight. I pushed the door open with the back of my hand, flashlight aimed into the darkness outside. The porch was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking. The ground was damp from the evening dew. No footprints, no signs of movement, just silence. I stepped out slowly, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but that door hadn't opened on its own. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had the wind blown it open? No, the wind wasn't that strong. I stood there for a long time, listening. Then, finally, I went back inside and locked the door again. I wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had left it unlocked. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. But the whole time, I felt watched. The feeling was subtle, like something at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. The trees felt closer. The silence felt heavier. That night, I made sure the door was locked. I checked it 3 times before bed. I kept the hatchet within reach, the flashlight beside me. I woke up again. This time, I heard it. Footsteps. Outside, just beyond the porch. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. not the random creaks of an old cabin settling. Human footsteps moving in the dirt. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped. Then, a long, tense silence. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It didn't jerk. Turned smoothly, like someone testing it. Like someone who didn't need to force their way in. Someone who thought it should be open. I stayed completely still. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Then, the knob turned back, and the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady. Not running. Not afraid. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally got up and checked outside, the ground was disturbed. A single set of footprints, leading from the trees to my door, and then back again. No car tracks, no tire marks, just footprints. I packed my things in record time, threw everything in the truck and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road hours later, where my phone finally had service again. When I checked the weather, I noticed something strange. It had rained the night before, hard. The ground should have been wet, muddy, soft, but the footprints, they were dry. I don't know why I thought staying in the old hunting cabin alone was a good idea. It wasn't even my cabin. It belonged to a friend of a friend, some guy I had never met but who was generous enough to let me use it for a few days. The idea was simple. Get away from the noise of the city, enjoy some solitude, and maybe do some hiking in the surrounding forest. But as soon as I arrived, I knew something about the place felt off. The cabin itself was old, built sometime in the 60s, and hadn't seen much upkeep since. The wood siding was warped from years of harsh winters, and the metal roof was speckled with rust. There was a small front porch, but the railing was missing in places, and the single rocking chair that sat there was bleached gray from the sun. The front door had a heavy iron latch instead of a standard lock, and when I pushed it open, the hinges let out a groan that echoed into the silence. Inside, it smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly sour like old sweat. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a sagging couch covered in an ugly plaid fabric. The kitchen area was just a counter with an ancient propane stove and a deep, stained sink. The cabinets were stocked with canned goods, most of which looked years past their expiration date. The bedroom was small, just a bed with a lumpy mattress, a single dresser, and a tiny window that barely let in any light. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush. There was no cell service, no electricity, just me and whatever was out there in the woods. The first day went by without much trouble. I set my gear down, gathered some firewood, and made a simple dinner on the propane stove. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, with pine and aspen trees towering over me. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. I found it peaceful at first, a break from the constant noise of the city. That night, however, things started to feel wrong. Lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin made plenty of its own noises, the creaks and groans of old wood settling, the occasional scratching sound that I assumed was from mice in the walls. But there was something else. Presence. It felt as if someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching. I told myself it was paranoia, that I wasn't used to being so isolated. But that didn't stop the unease from creeping into my chest. I forced myself to sleep. It didn't last long. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Not an animal. Not the skittering of a squirrel or the cautious steps of a deer. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen beneath the thin blanket. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice. Then they stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My brain scrambled for logic. Maybe it was a hunter, lost in the woods. Maybe it was some old hermit who didn't realize the cabin was in use. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever it was, they were standing there, listening. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the hunting knife I had brought with me. When the first light crept through the trees, I forced myself to step outside, scanning the area for any sign that someone had been there. The dirt around the cabin was dry and packed, not ideal for tracks, but near the window, in a patch of soft earth, I found them. Footprints, bare footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and they led from the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared. I wanted to leave right then, pack my bag, hike back to my truck, and drive until I hit civilization. But pride got in the way. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe they weren't as fresh as they looked. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. I stayed, and that was a mistake. The second night was worse. I barricaded the door with the table, checked my knife a dozen times, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It wasn't long before the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more confident, and they weren't alone. 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3. They moved in different directions, one circling, another stopping just outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow, deep, measured. The kind of breathing you hear when someone is trying to be quiet but isn't quite succeeding. Then, a sound that made my stomach drop. The latch on the door rattled. I bolted upright, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The latch rattled again, harder this time. They were testing it, checking to see if I had locked it. Then silence. I stayed like that, rigid, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and the sounds outside faded. When I finally found the courage to step outside, the footprints were back, and they were fresh. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag in record time, grabbed my hunting knife, and started the hike back to my truck, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I reached my truck just as the sun fully rose, the relief so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. I didn't look back as I drove away. Later, I told my friend what had happened. He went pale, said he'd heard stories about that cabin, about people who had stayed there and left feeling the same unease. Some even claimed they saw figures standing in the woods at night, just beyond the tree line. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing: I'm never going back. The drive out was longer than I remembered. The last time I had been up here was 2 years ago, before everything in my life had changed. Back then, I was engaged, living in the city, working a steady job. Now, things were different. The engagement was off. The city had drained me, and I'd left my job in favor of something less corporate, less soul-sucking. This trip to the cabin wasn't about nostalgia. It was about getting away from everything for a while, finding some clarity in the silence of the woods. I had inherited the cabin from my grandfather, a simple one-room structure deep in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a sturdy wooden shelter with a cast-iron stove, a small bed, and a few worn pieces of furniture. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an old propane lantern for light. It sat at the end of an overgrown dirt road, miles from the nearest paved street. The isolation had been part of its appeal. By the time I pulled up in my truck, the sun was setting behind the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, the windows dark like empty eyes. I shut off the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, a crisp mountain scent that instantly made me feel lighter. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed inside. The heavy wooden door creaked as it swung open, and dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed since the last time I'd been here. I set my bag down on the cot and checked the cabinets for supplies. A few cans of beans, some rice, an old box of crackers that had probably gone stale. I'd brought enough food for the weekend, but it was good to know I had backup. After unpacking, I went out to the well to fill a jug with water. The handle was stiff from disuse, but after a few cranks, clear, cold water splashed into the bucket. I carried it inside, set it on the counter, and then went back out to gather some firewood before the light was completely gone. The trees whispered around me as I worked, the wind moving through the branches in long, drawn-out sighs. I had just finished stacking the wood on the porch when I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct. A branch snapping somewhere in the trees behind the cabin. I froze, listening. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. My heart started beating a little faster. Could have been a deer, I told myself. Or a fox. The woods were full of animals. Still, I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Nothing. I shook it off and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I lit the propane lantern and sat at the small wooden table, eating a can of chili straight from the tin. The silence of the cabin was both comforting and unsettling, like being alone in a church after dark. I read for a while, an old paperback I had left here years ago, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound I'd heard. It was probably nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to a noise outside, a steady, rhythmic scraping against the porch. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. A long, slow drag of something heavy across the wooden planks. My stomach clenched. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The scraping stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, ears straining for any other sound. The wind had picked up again, rattling the branches outside. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe an animal had knocked something over. Maybe it was just the wind shifting debris across the porch. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations felt right. After a long minute, I got up and moved toward the door as quietly as I could. I pressed my ear against the rough wood and listened. Silence. I hesitated, then slowly unlatched the door and eased it open just a crack, shining my flashlight onto the porch. The beam swept across the wooden floorboards, revealing nothing but a few fallen leaves and my neatly stacked firewood. I stepped out, the cold night air prickling against my skin. The flashlight's beam cut through the dark, but beyond the clearing, the trees were an impenetrable wall of black. I listened, scanning the woods for movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the creak of the old porch beneath my feet. Then I saw them. Tracks. Large, deep impressions in the dirt, leading up onto the porch. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks either. They were wide, irregular, as if whatever had made them had been dragging something behind it. I followed them with my flashlight, tracing their path from the tree line to the steps, then back into the woods. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone, or something, had come right up to my door. And whatever it wasn't in a hurry to leave. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in the cot with my flashlight and my knife, listening to every creak, every rustle outside. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I stepped out onto the porch again, hoping I had imagined the tracks in the dark. They were still there, only now there were more of them. I didn't pack. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag in the truck, and peeled out of there, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the old road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it the following year, never telling the buyer what I had seen. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places belong to something else, and I wasn't about to find out what. I took a trip out to the woods to get some time alone. I had been feeling the weight of everything: work, life, the constant hum of noise in the city. I wanted space, quiet, fresh air. A friend of a friend owned a cabin in a remote area of Montana and said I could use it for the week. It was an old hunting cabin, barely more than a shack, but that was fine. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just needed solitude. The drive took me nearly 10 hours. Once I turned off the main highway, the roads were just dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense pine forest. There were no signs, no markers, just a set of directions scribbled on a piece of paper. After what felt like an eternity of driving deeper into nothing, I finally spotted the cabin. It was small, built of weathered logs, with a slanted metal roof that had rust creeping along the edges. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in grime. A woodpile was stacked against the side, an old axe buried in a chopping block nearby. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I parked my truck in the clearing and grabbed my bag. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the note had said. The door stuck as I pushed it open, the wood swollen from rain. Inside, it was even smaller than I expected. A single room with a wood stove, a narrow cot, a rickety table, and a few mismatched chairs. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the window. A couple of shelves held some canned goods, a lantern, and an old coffee pot. I set my bag on the cot and went back outside to gather some firewood before the sun dipped too low. The woods felt vast and silent. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of trees shifting. The quiet was unsettling. I was used to some background noise, traffic, voices, the hum of a refrigerator. Here there was nothing, just me. That first night I barely slept. The cot was stiff, and every sound made my ears perk up. The wind picked up at some point, making the trees groan. I heard a rustling noise outside, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. Could have been anything, a raccoon, a deer. I told myself that and forced my eyes shut. Morning came slow. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle misted the air. I made coffee on the wood stove and stepped onto the porch. The ground was soft from the rain, the air thick with the smell of wet pine. I saw something strange near the tree-line. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but then I realized it was something else. Footprints, not animal prints, human, barefoot. The sight of them sent a cold chill through me. The prints were fresh, not yet blurred by rain. They led from the woods to the edge of the clearing and then stopped. No return tracks, no sign of where they went next. I felt a deep unease settle in my gut. Maybe some hiker had wandered through, maybe a local out hunting. But why barefoot? And why come this close to the cabin just to stop? I scanned the trees, saw nothing. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and endless. I went back inside, locked the door, and forced myself to shake it off. It was probably nothing. I spent the day chopping wood, reading, trying to keep my mind occupied. But every so often, I glanced toward the tree-line, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, the rain got heavier. It drummed against the metal roof, masking every other sound. The wind howled, rattling the cabin walls. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to sleep. Sometime in the night, a sound cut through the rain. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze. Came again. 3 solid knocks against the wooden door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of the night in the rain? The nearest town was miles away. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. I didn't call out. Didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The cabin had one window, but it was too fogged up with moisture to see clearly. Minutes passed. Nothing. No more knocks. Just rain and wind. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard something else, a slow, dragging sound, like someone shuffling their feet through the wet leaves. It circled the cabin, moving deliberately, stopping just beneath the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then silence. The air felt thick, electric. I strained my ears, listening, waiting. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, slow exhale, right outside the window. I gripped the flashlight tighter, every muscle in my body coiled. The breath was too slow, too controlled to be an animal. I sat there, frozen, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally crept over the trees, I forced myself to step outside. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but near the window, I saw them again. Barefoot prints, deep in the mud, standing perfectly still. Whoever it was had been there for a long time, watching. I packed my things in record time, threw my bag in the truck and didn't look back. I drove out of there fast, not stopping until I reached the highway. I never told my friend what happened, never asked who else knew about the cabin. I just knew I would never go back. I had been driving for hours, winding through the dense forest, the road narrowing as I went deeper into the mountains. The rental cabin was supposed to be isolated, a quiet retreat where I could clear my head, away from the chaos of everyday life. I had planned this trip for weeks, wanting nothing more than to be alone in nature. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and a few books. The sun was already sinking behind the treetops when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted metal roof and a wraparound porch. A single, dim porch light flickered as I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of insects. It was exactly what I wanted, peaceful, empty. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaking steps, fumbling for the key the owner had left for me in a small lockbox by the door. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing the interior. A single room with a kitchenette on one side and a wood-burning stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom and a single bedroom at the back. Everything was rustic but clean. The windows were large, letting in the last bit of daylight, though the thick trees outside cast long shadows across the floor. I set my bags down and went through the usual routine, checking the windows, locking the door, testing the water in the sink to make sure everything worked. There was no Wi-Fi and my phone showed no bars of service. That was fine. That was the point of this trip. The first night passed without much incident. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside. But by the second night, I started to notice things. Little things. First, it was the noises. I chalked them up to the cabin settling, the wind shifting the trees, a faint tapping against the wall, a soft creak on the porch. Normal sounds, I told myself, the kind of things you hear in an old building in the woods. Then there were the tracks. I had gone for a short hike that afternoon, taking a path that looped around the property. When I returned, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. Not mine. These were larger, deeper, like someone heavy had been walking around. I crouched down, studying them. They led from the edge of the trees to the front steps, then back into the woods. I stood up quickly, scanning the forest. The trees were still, the silence heavy. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, the noises got worse. Something scraped against the side of the cabin. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging across the wooden walls. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The wind had died down. The night was unnervingly quiet. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the trees beyond. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My skin prickled, and I stepped back from the window, forcing myself to breathe evenly. It was probably a raccoon, I told myself. A bear, maybe. Something looking for food. I barely slept that night, every creak and rustle keeping me on edge. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, feeling the chill of the dawn air. That's when I saw the scratches on the wall. Long, deep gouges running parallel down the wooden planks. Too high for an animal, too deliberate. I packed my bags right then and there. I didn't care that I had planned to stay a few more nights. The trip was over. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I loaded my car, I took one last look at the cabin. The front door was slightly ajar. I swore I had locked it. I didn't bother checking. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I don't know why I ever thought a solo trip to a remote cabin in the dead of winter was a good idea. I liked solitude, and I loved the feeling of being completely alone in nature, but there was a fine line between solitude and isolation. I was about to learn just how thin that line was. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, far from any town. The nearest paved road was over an hour away. I had rented it for a full week, wanting nothing more than to unwind, read, and maybe do some writing. The listing had described it as a true off-grid experience, which I took to mean no running water and no electricity. That was fine with me. I brought plenty of supplies, firewood, canned food, a solar lantern, and enough water to last the whole trip. There was a wood-burning stove for warmth, and my truck was parked just outside in case I needed to leave. The first 2 days were peaceful. The silence was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. At night, I listened to the wind rattle the bare trees and the occasional sound of snow slipping off the roof. I kept the fire going, stayed wrapped in blankets, and enjoyed the disconnect from the world. On the third night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, the embers casting a faint red glow. The only sound was the wind outside. Then I realized what had disturbed me. A noise that didn't belong. It had come from outside. A crunch, like something heavy stepping on the frozen ground. I sat up slowly, my breath visible in the cold air. The wind gusted again, making it hard to hear, but I listened. Another crunch, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but it sounded too deliberate. I stayed completely still, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. My truck was parked to the side, so there was nothing blocking the view from the single front window. If I had the nerve to move the curtain, I could probably see what was out there. I didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. Slow, measured steps moving back into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for them to return. They didn't. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. The wind had played tricks on me, or an animal had wandered too close. Still, I checked outside, scanning the ground. There were tracks, large, boot-shaped prints in the thin layer of snow, circling the cabin once before leading back into the woods. I told myself it was an old set of tracks, that they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed them. But deep down, I knew better. I should have left that morning, packed up my things, thrown them into the truck, and driven away. But I didn't. I stayed. I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. The next 2 nights were quiet. Too quiet. I barely slept, listening for the sound of those footsteps, but they never came back. It wasn't until the 6th night that something else happened. It was late. The fire was still going, casting flickering light across the cabin walls. I had been reading when I heard it. A creaking sound, faint but distinct, came from the front door. I froze, book still in my hands. The door was locked. I had checked it multiple times. But there it was again, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone was pressing against it. I got up slowly, my heart pounding. There was a shotgun mounted on the wall, something the cabin owner had left, but I had no idea if it was loaded. I grabbed the fire poker instead, gripping it tightly. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. Didn't. Minutes passed. The wind howled outside, but nothing happened. Finally, I forced myself to move. I crept to the window just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just darkness and snow. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to eat. I went outside to start the truck. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I checked every door before I went to bed. But now it was wide open, snow dusting the seat. I climbed in, my hands shaking as I reached for the keys in my coat pocket. I turned the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. I tried again. Still nothing. The truck was dead. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest road with no cell service, no way to call for help. I could hike out, but it would take hours in the snow, and the idea of walking through the woods knowing someone had been outside my cabin all week made my skin crawl. I forced myself to think. The battery was dead, but maybe it was just the cold. I popped the hood, went to check, and stopped cold. The battery was gone. Someone had taken it. Not just tampered with it, not just cut the wires, they had removed it completely. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, feeling more exposed than I ever had in my life. I had no choice. I grabbed my pack, took only what I needed, and started walking. I kept my head down, moving fast, listening for any sound behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my fingers numb. Just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I reached the main road. A single car passed, and I ran into the middle of the road, waving frantically. The driver stopped. I barely remember what I told him, just that I needed help. He took me to the nearest town, where I called the cabin owner and the police. They sent someone out to check the property. They found the truck, the cabin, my abandoned gear, but no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. They told me it was probably an animal that had scared me, that my truck battery had been stolen by some random thief passing through. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to retrieve my things. Some nights, though, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams, circling just outside, waiting for me to open the door. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city, a chance to breathe in fresh air and let my mind settle. It was a simple structure, a single-story log cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The closest town was about 45 minutes away by car, and the last stretch of the road was a narrow, winding dirt path that made me second-guess my decision more than once on the way in. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. A small porch out front overlooked a clearing, beyond which the thick forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Inside, the furnishings were simple. Just a bed, a worn-out couch, a tiny kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. The only modern amenity was the solar-powered lights, which flickered weakly when I tested them. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no way to contact anyone if something went wrong. That was the whole point. Or at least, that's what I told myself when I signed up for this trip. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up a small fire outside, and cooked a quick meal. The silence out there was different from anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound. No distant hum of cars, no background noise of people, no music. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the chirp of unseen insects. It was peaceful at first. Then it started to feel unnatural. I went to bed early that night, exhausted from the drive. The bed was stiff. The blankets smelled faintly of mildew, but I managed to drift off. At some point in the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, a noise just outside the cabin. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to stand out against the overwhelming quiet. A slow, deliberate shuffling of footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped. Then came a soft scraping sound, like something dragging against the wooden porch. I stayed frozen in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch and examined the ground. The dirt was disturbed in places, but there were no clear footprints, just random scuffs and marks, as if something had been moving around. Maybe it had been an animal, I reasoned, a raccoon or a deer, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the lingering unease. The forest was dense, the trails barely marked. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a single other person the entire day. It was unsettling, but I reminded myself that isolation had been the goal. I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods, hoping the exhaustion would help me sleep better that night. Didn't. I woke again to the same noise. Footsteps, closer this time. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then came the scraping sound again. I clenched my jaw, trying to control my breathing. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. No animal moved like that. No animal lingered outside a cabin for hours. I waited, muscles tense, until dawn broke. Then I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The marks on the porch were more pronounced this time. Long, uneven scratches in the wood, like something had been dragged. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just the trees and the thick morning fog rolling in. I debated leaving, packing up and cutting the trip short, but I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking each latch before climbing into bed. I kept my flashlight within reach, my knife on the nightstand. I woke to something tapping against the window, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Not wind, not an animal. I turned my head, pulse hammering in my ears. The window was small, just beside the bed. The glass was old and dirty, barely reflective. But I saw it, just the faintest outline of a figure standing outside. Still, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stared at the window, hoping, praying, that I was imagining it. Then the tapping came again, louder this time. My fingers curled around the handle of the knife. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear had me paralyzed. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, it moved away. The footsteps receded into the trees, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded up my car, I noticed something near the tree line. Something small, half buried in the dirt. I walked over, hesitant, and nudged it with my foot. It was a knife, rusted, old, the blade chipped and worn. Beside it, half hidden by the undergrowth, was a single boot print, larger than mine, fresh. I didn't stay to investigate further. I got in my car and left, not looking back once. The entire drive back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road remained empty. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That I heard noises? That I saw a shadow outside my window? That I found an old knife in the woods? There was no proof, just a feeling, a deep, bone-chilling certainty that I wasn't supposed to be there. That whoever had been outside my cabin that night had been waiting for something, or someone. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I was looking forward to the solitude. That was the point of renting a remote cabin, just me, the quiet, and a break from the world. It was an old logging cabin, deep in the mountains, surrounded by thick trees and miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, just a wood stove, a creek for water, and a single-lane dirt road leading in and out. Perfect. The drive up had been long, the last hour spent crawling over rough, rutted roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The cabin sat in a clearing, tucked into the trees with a steep hillside rising behind it. The air was cool, carrying the damp smell of pine and moss. A small porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were dark, the old glass warped. It looked exactly like the photos, worn but sturdy, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I spent the first evening settling in. The cabin had an old propane stove, a rickety wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. A heavy iron wood stove squatted near the center of the room, its pipe vanishing into the ceiling. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and candles. I stacked firewood inside, filled a couple of pots with water from the creek, and set my gear by the door. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I lit a lantern and sat on the porch, listening to the wind moving through the branches. Peaceful. The first night passed quietly. The air turned cold, and I kept the fire going until early morning. At some point, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside, branches snapping, a soft thud, probably an animal. I listened for a while, but whatever was moved off and I fell back asleep. The next day, I explored the area. The forest was thick, the kind that swallowed sound. Trails wound through the trees, old logging roads barely visible under layers of fallen needles. I followed one for a while, walking until I found an old clearing where trees had been felled decades ago. The stumps were moss-covered, rotting. Something about the silence felt different there, too still. The hairs on my arms lifted. I turned back. That night, I locked the door, not out of fear, just habit. The wind picked up, rattling the branches against the roof. As I lay in bed, I heard it again. Movement outside. Not an animal this time. The steps were too deliberate, heavy. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and careful. A pause. Then, the unmistakable creak of a loose porch board. I sat up. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. My pulse thudded in my ears. Another creak. I waited, listening for the door handle. Nothing. Minutes passed. The wind howled. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind shifting the old boards. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not boots, bare feet, human. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the porch. My stomach tightened. I had no neighbors, no reason for anyone to be out here. The road in was rough enough that only someone determined would make the drive. The tracks led back into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth. I had no idea how long they'd been there. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to shake the unease. I carried my hatchet with me, even when I went to the creek for water. The woods felt different, the silence heavier. I considered leaving, but convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some drifter had wandered through, looking for shelter. It didn't mean they'd come back. That night, I kept the lantern lit. The wind had died down, leaving only the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Then, around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled, slow, measured. I gripped my hatchet, heart hammering. The lantern cast a glow through the windows, but I saw nothing. The steps stopped at the back of the cabin, near the wall where my bed was. I held my breath. Something brushed the wood outside. Fingers? A nail scratching? My skin crawled. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. I sat there, hatchet in hand, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won. When morning came, I found more footprints. This time, they led from the tree line straight to my door, then back into the woods. No tire tracks. No sign of anyone leaving by the road. Just those bare footprints, deep in the dirt. I packed my things, threw everything into my truck as fast as I could. The drive back down that narrow road felt endless, every shadow between the trees pressing in. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I never went back. I had been searching for solitude, a place to clear my head, to be alone with my thoughts. The stress of everyday life had been wearing me down, and when I stumbled across a listing for an off-grid cabin deep in the mountains, it seemed like the perfect escape. No cell service, no internet, just me and the wilderness. The drive took most of the day. The roads went from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement, then to gravel, and finally dirt. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. The directions had been simple enough, and the last turn led me onto a narrow, winding path barely wide enough for my truck. Trees closed in on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was exactly as the listing had described. A small, single-room structure with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked neatly against the side. There was an outhouse a short walk away and a well for water. No electricity, just a wood stove for heat and a few oil lanterns for light. It was perfect. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my supplies, chopped some wood, and made sure everything was in order. As the sun began to set, I lit one of the lanterns and sat on the porch, taking in the stillness. The forest was alive with sound. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened, that peacefulness began to shift into something else. The sounds of the forest changed. The usual rustling of small creatures gave way to something heavier, something deliberate. Footsteps, slow and measured, moving just beyond the reach of the lantern light. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe even a bear, but the longer I listened, the more uneasy I became. The steps weren't the erratic movements of an animal foraging or moving through the brush. They were steady, purposeful, almost human. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the darkness made it impossible. My instincts screamed at me to go inside, so I did. I locked the door, bolted the single wooden shutter over the window, and sat by the stove, listening. The footsteps continued for a while, circling the cabin. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I would jerk awake, certain I had heard something just outside. When morning finally came, I felt foolish. It had to have been my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the deep, unfamiliar darkness of the forest. Determined to shake off the nerves, I spent the day exploring. The woods were dense, the undergrowth thick, but I followed an old hunting trail that wound up a ridge behind the cabin. From the top, I could see for miles. Rolling hills covered in endless trees, untouched and wild. It was beautiful. On my way back, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the cabin, just off the path, the underbrush was disturbed. The ground was scuffed up, and there were deep impressions in the soil. Footprints, not animal tracks, but boots. Someone had been walking around near my cabin. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been an old hunter's trail. Maybe someone had passed through recently, but the thought didn't sit well with me. The prints looked fresh. That night, I made sure the fire was stocked and the lanterns were filled. I sat up late, listening. At first, everything was quiet, just the usual night sounds. But then, just like before, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, heart hammering. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to force their way in, but a slow, deliberate test. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever was out there was checking to see if the door was locked. I reached for the axe I had brought inside earlier and gripped it tightly. The rattling stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously, axe still in hand. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree-line to my door. They weren't mine. I followed them a short distance before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I had planned to stay for a week. By that point, I was seriously reconsidering, but I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no proof that whoever had been outside meant me any harm. Maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe someone just passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I kept my axe close, my ears tuned to every sound. And when night fell, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I barely breathed as the footsteps returned, closer this time. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden wall of the cabin. Something was dragging along the outside, circling me. Then, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the window shutter. Not forceful, just enough to let me know that whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. I had had enough. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what their intentions were. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and my axe and waited for the noises to stop. When they finally did, I crept out onto the porch, scanning the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I could feel eyes on me. I made my way to my truck as quickly and quietly as possible, my heart pounding. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the clearing, and for a split second, just before I threw it into drive, I saw movement at the tree-line. Someone stepping back into the shadows. I didn't wait to see more. I gunned it, tearing down the dirt path, not looking back. I drove straight through the night, only stopping when I reached the first gas station miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back for my things. I never even contacted the person who rented me the cabin. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But I can't, because sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That slow, deliberate tapping. And I wonder if whoever was out there that night has found someone else to visit. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. No cell service, no people, just the sounds of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. I had booked the place online, a one-room log cabin sitting on a small clearing, miles from the nearest road. It had no electricity, only a wood stove for heat, and a small creek running nearby for water. It was exactly what I needed. A place to reset, to be alone, to let my mind rest. The drive up was long, winding through miles of forest on dirt roads that grew rougher the deeper I went. By the time I reached the turnoff, I had been driving for nearly 5 hours. My truck's tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood. The structure was simple, just a rectangle of logs with a peaked metal roof, a stone chimney at one end, and a small porch with a single wooden chair. A stack of firewood was piled neatly against one side, and a narrow footpath led down to the creek. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. The air smelled clean, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. I got out and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my legs. The wind had a slight bite to it, hinting at colder temperatures once the sun set. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and made my way up the short set of steps onto the porch. The key was in the lock, just as the owner had promised. I turned it, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The cabin was even smaller than I had expected. A single room with a bed in one corner, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove against the far wall. Shelves lined one side, stocked with a few canned goods, an old oil lantern, and a tin box filled with matches. A single window overlooked the trees behind the cabin, its glass slightly warped with age. The floor was bare wood, scuffed and worn. It smelled like old timber and ash. I set my bag down by the bed and took a moment to look around. It was simple, but it was all I needed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I moved to the stove, checking the firewood supply. Enough to last a few nights, though I would need to gather more if I stayed longer. I pulled off my jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. By the time I had a fire going, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The warmth spread through the small space, pushing back the creeping chill. I pulled a can of soup from the shelf, opened it with my pocket knife, and set it on the stove to heat. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. I listened, hearing only the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It wasn't until later, as I was lying in bed, that I started to feel uneasy. It was that strange, creeping sensation, not fear exactly, but awareness, like the way you feel when you wake up in the middle of the night and know, instinctively, that someone is standing in the dark just outside your field of vision. I listened, straining my ears. Nothing, just the fire, burning low in the stove, and the wind, barely more than a whisper now. But something felt off. The silence outside wasn't normal. In the woods, there's always some kind of noise, branches shifting, animals moving, the distant call of an owl. But now there was nothing, just absolute, suffocating stillness. I rolled over, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, the silence pressing against me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again and something was different. The fire was out. The room was dark, the air cold. I sat up, blinking in the blackness. My breath came out in a visible cloud. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the rough wooden walls. Everything looked the same, but the fire shouldn't have gone out that quickly. I had stalked it well before lying down. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the floor freezing beneath my feet. I moved toward the stove, crouching down. The ashes were cold. That wasn't right. Even if the fire had died out, the embers should still have been warm. But they weren't. It was like the fire had been put out, deliberately. I stood up slowly, scanning the room. The door was still locked. The window was shut, but something didn't feel right. I moved to my bag, pulling out my knife. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring, but it didn't do much to calm my nerves. Then I heard it, a sound outside, faint, a soft scrape, like something moving just beyond the cabin walls. I froze, listening. Another sound, closer this time. A footstep. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I moved toward the window, careful not to make any noise. I lifted the edge of the curtain, just enough to see outside. The moon cast a dim glow over the clearing, the trees stretching into the darkness beyond. Nothing moved, but I knew, deep in my gut, that something was out there, watching. Then another sound. This time, it came from the other side of the cabin. I turned, gripping the knife tighter. My truck was parked just outside. If I needed to, I could make a run for it. But something told me that wasn't the best option. I needed to wait, to listen. For what felt like hours, I stood there, barely breathing. The sounds outside came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes close, but never clear enough to see what was making them. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The moment it did, the noises stopped. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. The cold morning air burned my lungs. I scanned the clearing, looking for anything, footprints, disturbed dirt, anything that might explain what had been out there. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest, like the night before had never happened. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and got in. As I started the engine, I felt that same sensation again, like I was being watched. I forced myself not to look back as I pulled out of the clearing, the cabin shrinking behind me. I drove for hours, only stopping once I reached a gas station near the highway. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, trying to shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me. I never went back. I could feel the road changing beneath my tires long before I saw the turnoff. The pavement, once smooth, had gradually turned rough, then into a patchwork of uneven gravel. Each mile I drove further from the main highway felt like a step deeper into isolation. The trees grew taller, denser, blocking out the last of the golden evening light. My destination was a remote cabin deep in the woods, a rental I'd found through an online listing promising solitude and seclusion. The listing had been vague, mostly boasting about the lack of cell service and the abundance of wildlife. It was exactly what I wanted, a break from the noise of daily life. I had stocked up on groceries, packed plenty of firewood, and made sure my car was in good shape before heading out. There was a certain nervousness in the back of my mind, that instinctual unease that comes with being completely alone in a place you've never been before, but I ignored it. I had camped alone plenty of times. This wouldn't be any different. The driveway to the cabin was barely a road, just a rutted-out dirt path overgrown with weeds. My car groaned as I maneuvered carefully over rocks and potholes. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was nothing more than a dull glow behind the hills. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just a simple A-frame with a wraparound porch, perched at the edge of a thick forest. No neighbors, no other signs of civilization, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was perfect. The first thing I did after unlocking the door was inspect the place. It was as basic as the photos had shown. A small living room with a wood stove, a kitchen with a propane stove, a single bedroom, and a cramped bathroom. There was no electricity aside from a few dim solar-powered lights, and the water came from a hand pump in the kitchen. I set my bags down and went back outside to unload the firewood from my car, taking in the absolute silence around me. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and I hadn't seen another person in miles. I should have felt relaxed, but instead, I felt exposed, vulnerable. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the effect of being alone in the middle of nowhere, but I still double-checked that the door locked properly when I went back inside. As the night fell, I built a fire in the wood stove and made a simple dinner. The silence outside was overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no music, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. Every little sound made me hyper-aware of just how alone I was. I slept lightly, waking up at every small noise. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, just a faint rustling. like dry leaves being disturbed. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then came a sound that was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps just beyond the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were steady, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Too slow to be an animal, too heavy. My body tensed as I lay motionless in bed. I had locked the door, but the windows had no shutters, just thin curtains barely concealing the inside. I told myself it had to be a deer or some other large animal wandering close, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. I heard a faint creak, the porch. For the longest time, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Then, suddenly, something scratched lightly against the door. I shot up, heart pounding. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't forceful. Just a slow, testing scrape along the wood. My breath felt stuck in my throat. My hunting knife was in my backpack across the room, and I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I sat in silence, waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. By the time the first hint of daylight broke through the trees, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a porcupine. Something harmless. Still, I checked outside as soon as it was bright enough to see. The dirt around the cabin was dry, but near the porch, I found footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot. I stared at them, my skin crawling. They weren't fresh, already slightly disturbed by the wind, but they were clear. Someone had walked around my cabin during the night. Someone had stood on the porch, listening. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. The drive back to the highway was the longest I had ever taken. Every turn in the road felt like it was hiding something watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I returned the key to the rental company, I asked about the cabin's history, about the area. The man behind the desk just shrugged. "Nobody's rented that place in a while," he said. "Too far out for most people. You're the first in months." I didn't tell him about the footprints. I didn't tell anyone. But I knew one thing. Whoever had been outside my cabin that night, they weren't lost. They weren't a hiker who had wandered too far. They had been waiting, and they had been barefoot. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. Just me and the quiet. No emails, no traffic, no noise. Just the sounds of nature and the crackle of a fire. I had rented the place through a small, independent site that catered to people like me, people who wanted solitude and didn't mind being off-grid. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road was a barely maintained dirt path winding through dense trees. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid the potholes and rocks, the forest pressing in on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was small but sturdy, built from thick logs with a wraparound porch. There was a woodpile stacked neatly against the side, and a stone chimney jutted up from the roof. The nearest neighbor was over 10 miles away, and cell service had cut out at least an hour back. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled of pine and dust, the air cool and slightly damp. The interior was simple, one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to a lofted sleeping area. There was a single window above the sink and another beside the front door. Both were grimy but intact. After unloading my supplies and lighting a few candles, I built a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, easing the evening chill. I ate a quick meal and sat on the porch, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The silence was complete. Not a car, not a voice, not even the hum of distant electricity. Just the wind in the branches and the occasional call of a night bird. It was perfect. ####. The first night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay still, listening, I heard it again. Something moving through the trees. A deliberate crunch of leaves, the snap of a small branch. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but it faded into the distance. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a coyote. I had chosen this place specifically because it was remote. I had to expect wildlife. Still, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. They didn't. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The second day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the area, hiking down to a small creek I had seen on the map. The water was icy cold, rushing over smooth stones, clear enough to see fish darting beneath the surface. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, more alive. I even found an old hunting stand, half collapsed and overtaken by moss. I spent the afternoon chopping wood and reading on the porch. As the sun set, I made dinner and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. But as darkness settled over the trees, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before heading to bed. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. That night, I heard the sound again. Closer. It was the same careful movement through the trees, slow and deliberate. This time, I sat up, heart pounding, straining to see through the small window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest was a black void beyond the glass. Then, a soft, unmistakable sound. A footstep on the porch. I froze. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light across the room. My breath sounded too loud in the silence. Another step, closer to the door. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the cabin entrance. The light caught the wood grain of the door, the handle unmoving. Nothing through the window, no shadows. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight, waiting. But the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The third day, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the porch, deep impressions, heavier than any animal, the shape unmistakably human. Someone had been there. I felt a sick drop in my stomach. Had they been watching me? Had they tried the door while I was asleep? I scanned the tree-line, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The woods felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, unnatural. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving back to civilization. But it could have been a hiker passing through, someone who had no idea the cabin was occupied. Maybe they had seen the lights and moved on. I tried to convince myself of that. That night, I kept the hatchet next to my sleeping bag. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. On the fourth night, the knocking started. It came just after midnight, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the front door. I sat up so fast my head spun. My skin prickled, every nerve in my body on edge. The knocking came again, steady, unhurried. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my throat had closed up. The fire had burned low again, barely illuminating the room. The flashlight sat on the table just out of reach. Then the doorknob rattled. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to shake the walls. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the hatchet. Another impact, something heavy hitting the wood, the hinges creaking under the force. I had locked it. I knew I had. And then, silence. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at the door. The seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. No more knocking. No more rattling. Just the fire's faint glow and my own hammering heartbeat. I didn't sleep after that. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed everything in record time, throwing my gear into the truck and locking up the cabin behind me. I didn't look for more footprints. I didn't check the woods. I just got in and drove, forcing myself not to look in the rearview mirror. The whole drive back, I kept expecting to see something in the trees, figure, a shadow, anything, but the forest was still. I never went back to that cabin. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That someone had watched me? That they had waited until the dead of night to let me know they were there? No one would believe me, but I knew, and I would never go back. I was looking for quiet, That's the only reason I rented the cabin. It was late October, and I needed a break from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. I found a listing for an old hunting cabin up in the mountains, about 4 hours from home. It was advertised as secluded, rustic, and peaceful. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and a well for water. Sounded perfect. The drive up was long, the last stretch of road barely maintained. Potholes, loose gravel, and the occasional deep rut made me nervous in my old SUV. The trees were thick, their branches bare, skeletal fingers stretching into the sky. The further I drove, the more the road narrowed, until it was little more than a single lane cutting through dense forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The cabin sat in a clearing, a squat, weathered structure made of thick logs. It had a metal roof, rusted in places, and a front porch with an old rocking chair that creaked slightly in the wind. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and with smoke from some distant cabin I couldn't see. I let myself in with the key left under a loose brick on the porch. Inside, the place was basic, just a cot, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A shelf in the corner held a few cans of food, some dusty plates, and an old lantern. There was a small window above the cot, its single pane cloudy with age. Another window looked out onto the trees at the back. There was a door leading outside from the kitchen area, though I didn't see much reason to use it. I settled in quickly, lighting the lantern and starting a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly, the only sounds the occasional pop from the wood and the wind outside. I ate a simple meal, then sat in the rocking chair on the porch, listening. There was nothing but the rustling of dry leaves and the faint hoot of an owl. Then I heard something else. It was faint, barely noticeable at first. A steady, rhythmic creaking. I assumed it was the wind pushing the trees, but when I focused on it, I realized it was coming from the woods. It sounded too deliberate, too even to be the random groaning of branches in the wind. I strained my eyes in the fading light, but the forest was nothing but dark shadows. The noise stopped. I told myself it had just been my imagination and went back inside. That night, I slept lightly. The cabin had a strange atmosphere, not quite unsettling, but different, isolated. I woke up several times, listening to the quiet. At some point, I heard movement outside, soft crunching footsteps on the leaves. I held my breath, but the noise faded before I could be sure I wasn't just dreaming. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning chopping some wood, took a short walk around the clearing, and read an old book I had brought with me. The day passed quickly, and as the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply. I made dinner and sat in the rocking chair again, watching the forest turn black. Then the creaking started again. It was slow, rhythmic, just like before. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but all I saw were the trunks and bare branches. The noise stopped. My heart was pounding. I listened for another minute, then went inside, locking the door. That night, I was woken by something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dead leaves. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving around the cabin. I could hear the sound shifting from one side to the other. Then came a soft scraping noise, like something dragging along the wooden walls. I grabbed the axe I had brought inside earlier and sat up in bed, holding my breath. The noise stopped for what felt like hours. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I had imagined it, there was a single knock on the front door. A slow, heavy knock. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. Another knock, just as deliberate as the first. Then silence. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, gripping the axe until my fingers ached. No more knocks came, but I heard movement just outside the window, the occasional crunch of leaves. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally let myself exhale. I stepped onto the porch, gripping the axe tight. The ground was disturbed. Leaves had been shuffled around. Something had definitely been outside my cabin. I walked around the perimeter, my nerves tight. Then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, large and deep, leading from the trees to my cabin and then away again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things and left, driving as fast as I could down that rutted road. I never found out who or what had been out there. Maybe it was a hunter, some drifter, or just some backwoods lunatic. But one thing was certain. I had not been alone in that forest. I never went back, and I never will. I had been searching for a secluded place to unwind, somewhere far away from the noise of the city. After weeks of looking, I found a listing online for a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. It was advertised as remote, with no cell service and miles away from the nearest town. That was exactly what I wanted. A week alone, just me and the wilderness. The drive out there was long, stretching nearly 8 hours from my home. The last 2 hours were nothing but winding dirt roads cutting through dense forest. My truck kicked up dust as I navigated the narrow path, the trees crowding in on either side, thick and towering. The directions had been clear. Follow the road until I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a tree that read, "Private property." Beyond that, a barely visible turnoff led to the cabin. When I finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the clearing. The cabin stood there, simple and sturdy. A single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, dark green shutters, and a heavy wooden door. There was a small woodshed about 20 yards away and an old water pump next to it. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly, untouched and silent. I stepped out of my truck, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no modern intrusions. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace. A small kitchen area with an old-fashioned stove and a battered wooden table sat to the left. To the right, a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser. Everything was clean but had that unmistakable aged smell, like wood that had soaked up decades of smoke and solitude. After unloading my gear, I lit the oil lamps scattered around the cabin and started a fire in the hearth. There was no electricity, but that was fine. I had brought plenty of supplies, canned food, a hunting knife, a rifle in case of wildlife, and enough firewood to last me through the week. It was shaping up to be exactly the quiet retreat I had hoped for. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, drinking whiskey from a flask and watching the stars. The sky was clear, the kind of darkness you only get far away from civilization. Eventually, I turned in, the crackling fire in the hearth the only sound as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving slowly over the dried leaves and underbrush. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It wasn't an animal. Animals move with a different kind of rhythm, erratic, darting movements. This was steady, deliberate. I reached for my rifle, creeping to the window. The porch was empty, but the sound hadn't stopped. It was circling the cabin, just beyond the ring of firelight cast from my lamps. I strained my eyes, trying to see past the darkness. Nothing. Then silence. I stood there, gripping my rifle, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Perhaps a deer, curious but cautious. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, but something stood out. Large, heavy footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They weren't from an animal. The shape was too human, too deliberate, but there were no other signs of disturbance. No broken branches, no claw marks, no blood. Just those footprints. I spent the day exploring the woods, trying to shake off my unease. The forest was beautiful, but it had an unnerving stillness. I didn't see any signs of other people. No cabins, no trails, nothing to suggest someone else was nearby. But I couldn't ignore those footprints. Someone had been out there. That night, I locked the door and made sure my rifle was loaded before going to bed. I kept the fire burning low and lay there, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, my body rigid. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone testing the glass. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the window from the corner of my eye. There was no face, no silhouette, just darkness beyond the glass. Then the tapping stopped. A long pause, followed by the unmistakable sound of the porch boards creaking. Someone or something was walking up to the door. I sat up slowly, gripping my rifle. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the handle rattled, just once. Not forcefully, but enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. I shot up, aimed my rifle at the door, and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated. I waited, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. When I was sure they were gone, I stayed awake until dawn, watching the door, waiting. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously, my rifle still in hand. More footprints, leading away from the cabin. I followed them for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of where they had come from, no sign of anyone living nearby. I lasted one more night before I decided to leave. That final night was the worst. I heard movement outside again, closer this time. It circled the cabin repeatedly, stopping at the door, the windows. I never saw who or what it was, but it wanted me to know it was there. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my gear and left, driving down that long dirt road without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had been out there watching me? That I had spent 3 nights alone in a cabin with something just beyond the firelight? Waiting? I never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. But I know one thing. I was not alone in those woods. It started as a simple plan. A week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, far away from everything. I wanted to disconnect from the noise of daily life, to let my mind settle in the quiet. It wasn't my first time doing something like this. I had spent plenty of nights alone in the wilderness, camping or renting isolated cabins, and I never once felt afraid. This time felt no different, at least at first. The cabin was a small, one-room structure with a lofted sleeping area, a wood stove, and a narrow porch. It sat about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick pine and aspen forest. There was no running water, only a hand pump outside, and electricity came from a small solar panel that barely kept the lights on after dark. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but beyond that, I was completely alone. That's exactly what I wanted. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, hiking the narrow trails around the cabin, and sitting by the creek that ran a few hundred yards down the slope. Nights were quiet, just the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. The solitude was perfect, but on the 3rd night, things started to change. It was past midnight when I woke up, feeling uneasy. I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, no wind, no rain, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, something felt off. I listened, waiting for a sound, a reason for my unease. Nothing. Just the stillness pressing against my ears. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind adjusting to the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I went about my routine, but I noticed something strange. The pile of firewood I had stacked near the door was disturbed. A few logs had rolled several feet away, lying in the dirt. It wasn't windy, and no animals around here were big enough to knock them over like that. Maybe I had stacked them poorly, I told myself, but I knew that wasn't true. That night, I made sure to secure the door tightly before bed. The latch was simple but sturdy. Nothing could push it open from the outside. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring at the wooden ceiling above me, listening. At some point, exhaustion won over and I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again, this time to a sound. A faint scratching, just outside the cabin. It wasn't the frantic scrambling of a rodent or the occasional rustle of a raccoon. It was deliberate, slow, dragging. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, just beneath the porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, but all I got was silence. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. I hesitated before standing, then moved toward the door. My fingers hovered over the latch, but I didn't open it. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was out there. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. The next morning, I found deep scratches in the porch wood, parallel lines, like something had dragged its nails across the surface. My first thought was a bear, but the spacing was too narrow, the marks too precise. And besides, bears don't just scratch around a cabin in the middle of the night without trying to break in. I spent the day on edge, checking my surroundings, looking for any sign of an animal or a person. I found nothing. No tracks, no signs of disturbance beyond the porch. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my stomach. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight within reach, listening for any sound. Hours passed, and I started to convince myself it had been nothing, maybe just an animal passing through. But then, just past 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was louder, the same slow dragging, but closer, right outside the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped the flashlight, debating whether to turn it on, but I was too afraid of what I might see. Then something brushed against the door. Not a knock, not a push, just a slow, deliberate press like someone was leaning against it. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the door, at the wooden latch holding it shut. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure disappeared. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but eventually, exhaustion took me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. When morning came, I made my decision. I packed my gear, locked up the cabin, and started the long hike back to my car. Whatever had been outside my cabin, whatever had been watching me, it wasn't something I wanted to meet in daylight, let alone at night. As I reached my car and turned the engine over, I felt a lingering sense of unease, like I had left something unfinished. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But as I pulled onto the main road, heading back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left that cabin just in time. That if I had stayed one more night, whatever was out there wouldn't have just scratched the porch or pressed against the door. It would have come inside.